America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At Grand Canyon University, we believe in equal opportunity, and the American dream starts with purpose. To serve others in ways that promote human flourishing and create a ripple effect of transformation for generations to come. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan.
And I'm Linda Brobeck.
And on this episode, Linda and I will be covering Curtain, Poirot's Last Case, Christie's penultimate novel, the final novel to be published in her lifetime, and the final novel to be covered on this podcast. And that is right, my super secret guest co-host is not David Suchet, as many of you suspected it was going to be. With all due respect to Sir David, my co-host, I think, brings much more to the table today than he ever could have, because Linda Brobeck is the mother of my dear co-host, Catherine Brobeck, who passed away at the end of last year and who I miss so much, and who I wish with every fiber of my being could be here right now. Because Curtain was the one book Catherine chose never to read, given what happens in it. And I was so looking forward to discussing it with her and getting her unique take on it. Linda, I am so thrilled and honored to have you on today. This is obviously extremely bittersweet, but I think it's also so appropriate to have you on as a co-host because just as Curtain ends where it began, at Styles, you could say this podcast is also ending the way it began. Catherine always talked about how her first exposure to Christie was sitting in your lap, watching, yes, David Suchet in Agatha Christie's Poirot. And you've been a longtime listener and supporter of the podcast. Catherine always wanted to have you on at some point. This is not the way any of us wanted that to happen, but nevertheless, it is truly lovely to be able to share this final novel with you. So welcome. And I have to ask at the outset, because I know it's the question all of our listeners would want to ask too. How are you doing? And how is the rest of Catherine's family doing?
Thank you, Kemper. I'm happy to be here, of course. And I am doing as you would expect that I would do. I lost my beloved daughter. And it's hard. There's no question about it. It's hard. For whatever it's worth, I believe Catherine is actually with me today here. I talk to her all the time, and I specifically asked her to be present with me while I do this in honor of her. We discussed many of the Agatha books, and I know we would have had the best conversation around this book. I'm really looking forward to discussing it with you. I don't know that my opinions would be Catherine's, but I do know that we would have engaged in really wonderful dialogue around some of the points that I have noted as my notes to go over with you.
Yes, Catherine didn't agree with anyone necessarily, so I'm sure you would have had lots of disagreements, just as Catherine and I always had lots of disagreements. Thank you so much for being here, Linda. I know this isn't easy, but I am so grateful that you agreed to come on and co-host this book. And before we get started on a book that really centers on a deep and abiding friendship, I wanted just to take a moment to acknowledge how much Catherine still means to me as a friend, and also how much she means to so many of the podcast listeners. It's honestly a lot more than I ever realized. It wasn't till I compiled all those emails and Twitter messages and Facebook posts and Instagram comments that listeners sent to me about Catherine that I was able to grasp the full extent of what she meant and what she still means. And I did all that compiling because you asked me to, Linda, so that you and the rest of Catherine's family could have all these messages to look at and to read. And not to make this about me, but that's exactly what I'm going to do for a second. It was almost an outer body experience for me reading all those messages, because for as long as I was reading them, I was able to see myself by way of all the kindness and the grace and the love that people were bestowing on Catherine for this thing that we did together. And I remember my first instinct was to push it all away and just to think to myself, well, everyone's just being nice. They can't actually mean all these lovely, wonderful things that they're saying. But I knew that wasn't true. I knew that every word that all of you listeners sent to me about Catherine was deeply heartfelt. And it just gave me this searing moment of pride and contentment in what Catherine and I created together. And that just isn't something that you often get in your life. And I know you've said this before, Linda, but I really wish that Catherine had been able to get that too. So I like to think of that as Catherine's gift to me and your gift to me as well, Linda. And I just, from the bottom of my heart, want to thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Kemper, for compiling those. And thank you so much to all the listeners who made comments on social media and sent you emails. I can't even begin to tell you how meaningful they were for not only me, but Barry, and for Catherine's sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth ultimately printed those out, compiled them, and put them into a binder. And on a glorious day in June, we did a celebration of Catherine's life. And all of your comments were there in this binder that people could leaf through and read and know that Catherine was loved by so many of you. And it will be meaningful to me for the rest of my life. So I thank all of you. And Kemper, you know how much I love you and appreciate what you've done. It was an act of love to put all those together, and it was much appreciated.
Well, logging onto Facebook is definitely an act of love, because that's not something I relish. Yeah.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. Not my thing either.
Thank you for that. And I can attest, by the way, to the power of that binder and all those messages, because I was there on that glorious day in June when we celebrated Catherine, and it added to the many testaments and exhibits, really, exhibitions. Linda is an artist, which is something that Catherine mentioned many times on the podcast. And she approached the project of celebrating Catherine as an artist and essentially created a gallery of the many aspects of her daughter. And it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And
thank you.
It was really lovely. So the other thing I have to bring up before we get started on Curtain, which I promise we will get started on. And this one is not going to involve as much crying, maybe happy tears for me. It's a much happier news item. But Catherine and I chose from the start not to talk too much about ourselves on this podcast, other than in passing, as we always wanted the focus to be on Christie and her work and on our enthusiasm for that work as readers and viewers. But obviously, all bets are off on that front in his final novel episode. So I am just going to go ahead and take a moment to inform you all that I will be publishing a mystery novel of my own creation.
Yay.
That's right, listeners. I wrote a mystery, and at long last, I have a publishing deal in place for it. It's been a long journey, one that Catherine was well aware of and very sympathetic to, as she was also a writer. I actually published, I don't think I've ever talked about this before on the podcast, but I did publish one novel just before we began the podcast. It's a book called The Decent Proposal. It's not a mystery. It's a literary love story, though it does have some suspense elements. Feel free to check it out if you'd like. And then I faltered a bit on my sophomore effort, which was a very cliched thing for me to do as a writer. And I have to say that it's this podcast that helped me find my way. A few years into it, as I was struggling to write my second book, I realized, I think I'm pretty passionate about mysteries. So why don't I just write a mystery? And I did. And now it's going to be out in the world for all of you to read. There is nothing for you to do about it now. It's way too early to pre-order. It probably won't be published till early 2024 because the book world is slow as molasses. But just know that it's fun and contemporary and features lots of nods to Agatha Christie, of course. The title for now is That Woman, but that might change between now and publication. Don't worry, I'll keep you abreast of all developments, but I just wanted to share the news with all of you now and on this episode in particular, because it really was by tapping into the passion for Agatha Christie that Catherine and I shared that I was able to find my way as a writer. That really is true. And it's funny, but sometimes I think to myself that there's no question Agatha Christie herself would have been supremely weirded out and probably even repulsed by this podcast. Like, I can totally imagine her saying to herself, why are you spending so much time going over every little detail? What is wrong with you? And yet I do think, I flatter myself in thinking that Christie would have approved of the fact that I managed to harness all that weird passion into creating something of my own. So I just wanted to let you all know that our long preamble is finally done. I am actually going to release you now, Linda, while I tackle the usual summary that Catherine and I did so many times for Curtain, Poirot's Last Case. I will meet back up with you on the other side of that summary when it's time to discuss the rankings for this book. I hope that introduction wasn't too much, listeners. It's just before I ended this formal review of the novels that Catherine and I started 6 years ago, if you can believe it, I thought it was important to hear from her loved ones about how they're doing. And not to sanitize or gloss over that grief, which is something that happens to Linda a lot. She was telling me that before we started recording about how acquaintances ask her how she's doing, and they really just want her to say fine and move on. But it's nowhere near as simple or as easy as that. And I'm so grateful to Linda, not only for coming on, but for being truthful about what she's experiencing. And of course, what better novel in which to discuss all this? Curtain, Poirot's Last Case, is simply drenched in death and loss and grief and sadness. This is quite simply a brilliant title. The curtain falls at the end of the show, so a curtain is redolent of death, and yet also of the flair and drama that comes with the territory of any Poirot novel. It just feels like there's no other possible title for this book, which is as good an indication that it's working as any I can think of. I'm reminded of my co-host, Tony Medower, who made this point on our Sleeping Murder episode, that Curtain actually has its counterpart in Nemesis, another single 7-lettered word title that I think most readers would agree is another of Christie's best. And unlike in the case of Sleeping Murder, Miss Marple's Last Case, the subtitle here, Poirot's Last Case, is entirely appropriate because, of course, this has to be Poirot's Last Case. I have to say, though, given that I've always associated this title with death, I thought it was interesting that when it comes up in the book, it's not in the context of the final curtain falling on Poirot's life. Poirot is warning Hastings that eventually Hastings will figure out what the heck is going on, eventually. And Poirot tells him to rest assured my indications will lead you to the truth. And then Poirot pauses and adds, and perhaps then you would wish that they had not led you so far. You would say instead, ring down the curtain. And this same phrase gets repeated a little later within the same context. So it's not so much the end of a person's life as the end of an investigation. And I find that meaningful because that, of course, is what Poirot and we as readers do in every one of these mysteries. We search for answers, and it's sad to imagine Hastings or any of us giving up before we find those answers. So I really was not expecting such a nuanced usage of this word. That was a pleasant surprise, since, of course, the death resonance is still there as well. As usual, there are layers to Christie when it comes to the titles she chose to use. And also, I love this fun fact, which I learned from my good friend Mark Aldrich, that at one point, while Christie was making notes on a draft of the novel, she actually added the words, and now bring down this curtain, to the end of the manuscript Poirot sends to Hastings at the end of the book, though that did not make it into the final text. All right, so let's talk about the publication history of Curtain. Christie scholar John Curran had a lot to say about when Sleeping Murder may have been written, and he also has some quite salient points to make about when Christie wrote Curtain. The short of it is that it's still a slightly vexed question, since, like Sleeping Murder, it was published long after it was written, but it's a less vexed question. And this is what Curran has to say. When was Curtain written? Sad Cypress, which gets mentioned in Chapter 3 of the book, was published in March 1940 with a U.S. serialization beginning in November 1939. The address on the manuscript of Curtain is Greenway House, which Christie left in October 1942 on its requisition by the U.S. Navy. These are the two parameters on the writing of Curtain. So that's the range, somewhere between 1939-ish and 1942-ish. And Curran goes on to say that he's fairly sure Christie wrote the novel earlier within this range rather than later, given that there are notes in one of her notebooks titled Corrections Curtain, sandwiched between notes for two of the labors of Hercules, the horses of Diomedes and the apples of the Hesperides, if you'd really like to know. And given that these two stories were published in June and September 1940, respectively, that would mean Christie must have written Curtain in 1939, if not earlier. So I think we're relatively safe to say that this manuscript was written in the early years of the war, which is actually what Christie says in her autobiography. As I mentioned in my Sleeping Murder episode, Christie references an extra 2 books she wrote during the first years of the war. This was in anticipation of my being killed in the raids, which seemed to be in the highest degree likely as I was working in London. I mean, a broken clock is right twice a day, so sometimes what Christie said as to the timing of things in her autobiography has to be accurate, I suppose. And yet, as is so often the case with Christie, the truth is probably a little more complicated. Curran notes that in that somewhat infamous newspaper article Christie wrote for the Daily Mail about creating Poirot, she included this telling phrase: "There are times when I, too, have been tempted to commit murder." This, Curran theorizes, may have been the musing that led eventually to Curtain, Poirot's last case. Curran says the chronology fits. This article would have been written in all likelihood at the end of 1937 or the very beginning of 1938. He also makes the point that Christie had been toying for years with the idea of a last case for Poirot, often referencing this idea in her notebooks with the title Curtain. One of these jottings was probably written around late 1936, which would put the early plotting of Curtain years ahead of its supposed writing. And Curran goes on to say, the theory that Christie wrote Curtain and Sleeping Murder in case she was killed in the Blitz begins to look questionable, as the 1940 Blitz was an unimagined horror back in 1936. Nor can it have been a book held in reserve in case of a dry season when she didn't feel like writing. Curtain could only be published at the end of Poirot's and Christie's career, so it can in no way be considered a nest egg. And these are all good points, but I'd be remiss if I didn't refute them a little with what the OG Christie biographer Janet Morgan has to say, because it's pretty much exactly what Curran rails against. Here's Morgan. Agatha was anxious to build what she described to Cork as her nest egg in case she found herself unable to work, if, for instance, anything should happen to Rosalind or Max. Moreover, the Poirot book was written when Agatha was finding her Belgian detective insufferable. In it, he dies. As he was Agatha's main source of income, Poirot's last case had inevitably to be put into cold storage. Cork approved. Her original intention was that Max should have the Poirot and Rosalind the Marple book, but by the end of the war, she had changed her mind. The Marple story, eventually published as Sleeping Murder, was given to Max and Curtain to Rosalind. My sense is that Curran and Morgan are both probably a little right and a little wrong, because Agatha Christie, that very human genius, is nothing if not inconsistent. I also just have to say that Morgan's take puts me in mind of this 1987 television film that predates the David Suchet series. It's called Murder by the Book, and Catherine and I covered it for a Patreon episode a while back. Basically, the fictional Poirot has it out with the elderly Christie at the end of her career, when she's toying around with the idea of publishing Curtain at long last and killing him off. And it sounds really goofy, but it's actually really good. It's sort of a filmed play starring Peggy Ashcroft as Agatha and Ian Holm as Poirot. It's also a scant 50 minutes, so I highly recommend it if you haven't watched it. Anyway, the only bit of original research I have to shed on this matter comes by way of my close read of Sleeping Murder, followed immediately by Curtain. Because in both books, Christie references the Barretts of Wimpole Street, which I'm thinking could be used as proof that they weren't written too far apart, because I don't think that she makes this reference in any of her other books. In Sleeping Murder, Miss Marple compares the murderer to Mr. Barrett of Wimpole Street. And then here, Judith tells her father Hastings, don't start making a Mr. Barrett of yourself. And it's unclear if Christie's referencing the 1930 play or the 1934 film. But given that the play was much bigger in the US than in England, she's almost definitely referencing the movie. So perhaps we can also use this as proof that these two books weren't written too far from the release of that film, which was in 1934. And as I mentioned in my Sleeping Murder episode, the movie stars Charles Laughton, who not only famously played Poirot, but would go on to star as the barrister Sir Wilfrid Robarts in Billy Wilder's fabulous adaptation of Witness for the Prosecution. One last point about the provenance of this book. Mark Aldridge states that part of the plan involving Curtin was to ensure that Poirot's story was not continued indefinitely by other authors. Christie later cited the post-Ian Fleming James Bond continuation novels as an example of the type of book she didn't want to happen, as his creator ensured that Poirot did not survive the events of this final case. Of course, the Christie estate figured a way around this, and they have published 4 and counting Poirot continuation novels by Sophie Hannah, who is such a great friend to this podcast. And I have to say, these are the sorts of evolutions that take place over time. Agatha Christie Limited is not Agatha Christie. They have to make their own decisions, not all of which will be the same as Christie herself may have made. And who knows what sort of decisions Christie would have made in 2022, because she did not live in 2022. Such is the way of the world. But I just thought that was interesting that she was trying to guard against something that happened anyway. So we've covered when this novel was written. Now let's talk about when it was published. The simple answer is September 1975 by Collins Crime Club in the UK, and then later that same year by Dodd Mead. But let's dig a little deeper, shall we? And for this, I'm going to turn to Mark Aldridge yet again, because he really gets into it in Agatha Christie's Poirot, the Greatest Detective in the World. Here's what he has to say. In March 1941, Christie's longtime agent Edmund Cork had distributed a copy of the manuscript for Curtin to his American colleagues at Dodd Mead with strict instructions regarding its contents. My cable asking you not to offer Curtin for publication must have seemed rather strange, but you would understand it when you received the manuscript, Cork wrote. Obviously, this book can only be published as the last of the Poirot books. I need hardly say that Curtin should be regarded as strictly secret and confidential. And pausing now a moment from Mark's account, I actually learned from Christie biographer Janet Morgan that the reason this copy was sent to New York in the first place was that there was a general principle of dispersal, which Hughes Massey was applying to all important material since the office at 40 Fleet Street had already been bombed. Let's remember, in 1941, we are in the midst of the Second World War, and London is not a particularly safe place for documents. So that's why Christie's UK agents sent this manuscript along to New York, despite the fact that it wasn't going to be published anytime soon. So I think that the confusion on the part of Christie's American agents is understandable here. Continuing now with Mark's account, their confusion was not helped by the fact that the first version they received had pages in the wrong order, meaning that it made little sense. It also didn't help that some letters seemed to have gone astray, leading Harold Ober, that would be Christie's U.S. agent, to ask if Christie was quite sure that she wished to make Poirot's exit so final. This resulted in urgent clarification that the manuscript was not to be published for some time yet. I think Mrs. Mallowan must have been in a rather despondent state when she decided to kill off Poirot, Ober reasoned. After reassuring his colleague that once read in the correct order and given a polish, the book would be somewhat better, Ober actually suggested ways in which it could be reworked to ensure that Poirot survived after all. Christie's UK agent Edmund Cork insisted that, quote, it is a story that Mrs. Mallowan has had in mind for a long time, although she appreciates that it cannot be published until after her death, as it must be the last Poirot novel. So a corrected copy was distributed in September 1941, and it's this version that sat untouched for more than 3 decades. And then it was 33 years later, in fact, that the conversation was picked up again. And that was in late 1974, just as preparations were underway for the premiere of Murder on the Orient Express, at which point, as Mark writes, Rosalind Hicks made a somewhat surprising decision. And this decision of Rosalind's was very much made in the aftermath of Postern of Fate, which we have already discussed on this podcast, and which Rosalind was very unhappy about. I actually failed to include this in the Postern Fate episode I did with Caroline Crampton, but Mark has a bit to say about Rosalind's reaction to that book, and it's very much relevant to Curtin. So here's what he says. Christie's daughter, Rosalind Hicks, was desperately unhappy with the events surrounding the writing of the new book, as well as its final quality. She saw it as a watershed moment for her mother's future as a writer, which in turn sealed the fate of Poirot. "I can't say that I enjoyed the book," she wrote candidly to Billy Collins. "My mother is very frail now and not at all well, and I do hope she is not going to sap her remaining strength by starting another book. She is determined to do all she can, and I know nothing except her health would deter her. I know we all want to do the best we can for my mother." I really do mind about the kind of book she writes, and I honestly feel guilty to think of people paying £2 for such a pathetic effort, she went on to say. "I am also quite worried that this might happen again next year." So, as we know, the Christie for Christmas in 1974, the year after Postern of Fate, ended up being a collection of early Poirot short stories titled Poirot's Early Cases, all of which we've covered on this podcast by this point. And then, as 1975 rolled around, Rosalind decided it was time for Curtain to be unearthed from that vault. A little early, since the plan had been that they would wait till Christie passed away. But the decision was made, and quoting again now from Mark, who quotes Rosalind, "I've been thinking again about Poirot's last book, Curtain," she wrote to Edmund Cork. "My idea is that if there is no new Christie for Christmas next year, we should publish this. I have not, of course, mentioned this to my mother as yet, but would have to consult her. It might be a good idea after Hercule Poirot's early cases to have Hercule Poirot's last case." Rosalind apparently had what must have been a difficult conversation with her mother. And Cork informed Christie's U.S. publisher Dodd Mead that, quote, "Agatha has decided she will not write another Poirot book and has agreed that Curtain should be released for publication for Christmas 1975. Interestingly, since the novel had been gifted to Rosalind, she actually had to sell it to Agatha Christie Limited, the holding company that didn't exist back when Christie wrote Curtain. And they agreed on a figure. I wish I could tell you what that figure was, but I actually couldn't find it anywhere. So if anyone knows, I'd love to hear what that amount was. I'm just curious. Quoting again from Mark, who is once again quoting Rosalind, "I hope all goes well with it," she wrote. "I'm sure it is the right thing to do this year. I do not want, nor do I see any necessity for there to be any publicity that this book was once given to me." And go well it did. The stage was now set for a big ol' Poirot extravaganza. As Mark writes, by May 1975, newspapers had heard about the plans for a final Poirot novel, with some reports that it would see Poirot's death, something that had been kept a secret from most. By the time more details were made officially available in the summer of 1975, the success of Murder on the Orient Express created more interest than ever, which may explain why an obituary of the detective was famously placed on the front page of the New York Times in August, where news of his demise shares space with steel price rises and Malaysian terrorists. That means this obituary is actually a huge spoiler. The book wasn't even out yet. Very, very shocking. And I have to say, this obituary is referred to so often, but I feel like no one ever actually reads it, right? So I'm going to rectify this oversight right now, even though the obituary is a bit long, because I also think it's a bit fascinating, or a lot fascinating, actually. So here it is, listeners, taken from the bottom right corner of the front page of the New York Times on August 6th, 1975. Hercule Poirot, a Belgian detective who became internationally famous, has died in England. His age was unknown. Mr. Poirot achieved fame as a private investigator after he retired as a member of the Belgian police force in 1904. His career, as chronicled in the novels of Dame Agatha Christie, his creator, was one of the most illustrious in fiction. At the end of his life, he was arthritic and had a bad heart. He was in a wheelchair often and was carried from his bedroom to the public lounge at Styles Court, a nursing home in Essex. Not a nursing home, New York Times. Get your facts straight. Wearing a wig and false mustaches to mask the signs of age that offended his vanity. Poirot would have hated the inclusion of those two details. In his active days, he was always impeccably dressed. Mr. Poirot, who was just 5 feet 4 inches tall, went to England from Belgium during World War I as a refugee. He settled in a little town not far from Styles, then an elaborate country estate where he took on his first private case. The news of his death, given by Dame Agatha, was not unexpected. Word that he was near death reached here last May. His death was confirmed by Dodd Mead, Dame Agatha's publishers, who will put out Curtain, the novel that chronicles his last days, on October 15th. The Poirot of the final volume is only a shadow of the well-turned-out, agile investigator who, with a charming but immense ego and fractured English, solved uncounted mysteries in the 37 full-length novels and collections of short stories in which he appeared. Dame Agatha reports in Curtain that he managed in one final gesture to perform one more act of cerebration that saved an innocent bystander from disaster. Nothing in his life became him like the leaving it, to quote Shakespeare, whom Poirot frequently misquoted. Ooh, sick burn there from the New York Times. Don Mead had not expected another installment in the heroic achievements of the famous detective. No manuscript came in last year, and none was expected this year either. However, there had been many rumors to the effect that Dame Agatha had locked up two manuscripts, one a Poirot and one a Marple, in a vault, and that they were not to be published until her death. Jonathan Dodd of Dodd Mead said that the Poirot was the one now being published. Although the career of Poirot will no more engage his historian, a spokesman for the author said that Dame Agatha, who will be 85 September 15th, intends to continue writing. In her long writing career, one that parallels the literary existence of her detective, she has published 85 full-length novels and collections of short stories, which have sold 350 million copies in hardcover and paperback all over the globe. This figure does not include the pirated editions behind the Iron Curtain, of which no count can be made. Oh, I love that dated reference to the Iron Curtain. In addition, under the pseudonym of Mary Westmacott, she has written a half dozen romances. Not romances, New York Times. Moving on. What is perhaps more significant is that her first title, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, is still in print. At least 17 of her stories have been made into plays, including the famous The Mousetrap, which opened in London in 1952 and is still running, setting all kinds of records for longevity in the theater. 12 of her tales have become motion pictures, many of which have centered on Jane Marple, Dame Agatha's other famous detective. 12, what a quaint statistic that is, from the perspective of 2022 and the hundreds, if not thousands, of Christie adaptations we now have. In the person of the late Margaret Rutherford, Miss Marple developed her own devoted following. The most recent of Dame Agatha's movies, Murder on the Orient Express, opened last year with excellent box office returns, and Christie properties have been used for television mystery dramas and for radio shows. Her hold on her audience is remarkable in a way because the kind of fiction she writes is, well, not exactly contemporary. Her characters come from the quiet and exceedingly comfortable middle class. Doctors, lawyers, top military men, members of the clergy. The houses in her fiction are spacious, teas are frequent and abundant, servants abound. Just another side note here, but this is really not true, New York Times. The middle classes Christie wrote about were much more unsettled and problematic than this. They're being a little reductive and dismissive here. True, the comforts have been cut back as the real England in which her mysteries are set has been altered over the years, but the polite, leisure-class settings have been retained. I could never manage miners talking in pubs, she once confided to an interviewer, because I don't know what miners talk about in pubs. And now we have a new section titled Undisputed Head Girl. Not everyone has agreed to her high ranking. Robert Graves complained that, quote, her English is schoolgirlish, her situations for the most part artificial, her detail faulty. And I will just pause here to note that, believe it or not, Robert Graves was actually a personal friend of Agatha Christie's and also of her husband Max Mallowan's. Christie even dedicated 1944's Towards Zero to him. So apparently he didn't totally hate her or her work, even though he did rag on it in a very scathing Edmund Wilson-like review of detective fiction in general in 1957. And that's what the Times is quoting from now. That quote, by the way, just got propagated to death, probably in large part due to the fact that it's included here in this obituary. Back to the Times. On the other hand, Marjorie Allingham, herself a writer of whodunits, called her the, quote, undisputed head girl. And oof, that is a backhanded compliment if ever I heard one. Thanks, Marjorie. And the late Anthony Boucher, who reviewed mysteries for this newspaper, remarked, few writers are producing the pure puzzle novel, and no one on either side of the Atlantic does it better. Dame Agatha, who has been described as a large woman looking both kind and capable, why is that relevant, New York Times? Anyway, is the daughter of a well-to-do American father and English mother. She was tutored at home and attended, as she recalled, innumerable classes, dancing, singing, drawing. In World War I, she worked in a Red Cross hospital, and this experience gave her a good working knowledge of poisons, ingredients that turn up rather frequently in her books. In 1926, she suffered an attack of amnesia, left home, and was discovered some days later in a hotel under another name. The furor stirred up by the newspapers over her disappearance has made her shy of newspapers and reporters ever since. She has kept herself inconspicuous in public, even insisting for a while that no picture of herself appear on the dust jackets of her books. She has declined to be interviewed about the death of Poirot. In 1928, she was divorced from her first husband, Archibald Christie, and in 1930, she was married to Max Mallowan, an archaeologist. It has been said that she has brought Victorian qualities to her work, a charge she does not deny. She dislikes sordid tales and confesses that she could not write them. But another side of that Victorianism is that in all her years as a writer, she has had one publisher in America, Dodd Mead. Such steadfastness is surely of another age. Whew. Okay. So the Times won me over by the end. It is rather lovely that Christie was as loyal as she was to her agents and publishers on both sides of the pond. I never really thought about that, despite all that carping about book covers and dust jackets and whatnot. But as I was reading this obituary, it struck me that when it was published, Agatha Christie had the unique distinction of being able to essentially read her own obituary, because that's really how this article reads, right? And so when I had that thought, I then turned to the New York Times' excellent search engine for back issues so that I could compare this obituary of Poirot's to the one they surely did on Agatha Christie when she passed away a little more than 5 months later in January 1976. But here's the thing, listeners. I could not find an obituary for Agatha Christie upon her death. I do not think that there was actually an obituary put out upon the death of Agatha Christie in the New York Times. And I realize that this is shocking, or maybe it isn't, because this is part of a phenomenon and something that the Times has been trying to rectify recently. The fact that they fail to acknowledge the achievements of so many women and people of color and other marginalized communities over the years while continuing to lavish recognition on white males. And here, surely we have one of the most striking examples of that, in which a fictional man's death has been recognized, but the death of his non-fictional female creator has not. That is really insane. And I even did a little extra digging just to make sure the Times didn't have some weird policy of overlooking mystery writers or female mystery writers. But the following writers all had obituaries appear in the Times upon their deaths: John Dixon Carr, Freeman Wills Crofts, Ronald Knox, Marjorie Allingham, Dorothy Sayers, and Niall Marsh, those last three being the so-called queens of crime, along with Agatha Christie, of course. So this really does seem to be a Poirot thing. And I hate to say it, but Poirot kind of won. he got the obit, and Agatha Christie did not. So I just thought that was really, really interesting. And I could also be proven wrong on this. And should anyone out there have an obituary that does in fact exist in the Times, I would love to hear about it. But that search engine feature of the Times is really good, and I feel fairly confident that that obituary does not exist. But please, by all means, prove me wrong. I would be happy to be proven wrong on this front. So Curtain, Poirot's Last Case, was a smash hit when it came out, which surprised exactly no one. According to David Suchet in Poirot and Me, it was an instant bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic, with the first hardback edition selling 120,000 copies and the American paperback rights selling for $1 million. Mark Aldridge gives us a little more detail on that last factoid, writing that exceptional deals were struck for publishing rights. Pocket Books won a frenzied bidding war for the American paperback rights, paying an extraordinary $925,000. That's over $5 million in 2022. And again, that's just an advance for American paperback rights. So just a huge appetite here for this book. Christie just could do no wrong when it came to a new book of hers coming out. And yet, I was fascinated to learn from Christie biographer Laura Thompson that when it came to serialization rights, and now I'm quoting from her, Good Housekeeping turned down Curtain. I wish I could be making you a nice fat offer, but I'm afraid I can't even make you a small or reasonably adequate one. I must admit I found it tedious. Everybody was so old, and all the characters seemed to me to mesh into one Colonel Blimp. So apparently not everyone loved it. And I think that's really funny that it got $5 million for paperback rights, but couldn't get a serialization. Oh, how the times have changed. I think that that is indicative of the fact that serialization meant a lot less in 1975, publishing a novel in a periodical, than it did in the 20s when Christie made the bulk of her money, or at least a significant portion of her money from publishing on serialization rights. So this is what happens when you have published for 55 years. We will get to more critical reactions to this novel when Linda rejoins me later in the episode and we talk about the ranking of Curtain. But I just want to note now, by way of closing out the publication history for this novel, that there was also a new edition of Come Tell Me How You Live, Christie's other autobiographical book, which was published in the autumn of 1975, right around the same time as Curtain. I just thought that was interesting, so now you know. Of course, there is also the issue of where in the chronology of Poirot's fictional career this book fits in. And again, we came across this issue in Sleeping Murder, where it was obvious that Miss Marple was much younger in that book than in a number of the Miss Marple novels published before it. So despite the subheading Miss Marple's Last Case in the first edition of the book, Sleeping Murder was clearly not Miss Marple's last case. Curtain, of course, has to be Poirot's last case since he, spoiler, dies at the end of it. And yet there's still a question whether we should read this story as actually taking place after all the Poirots that came before it, with this Poirot existing in the world 3 years after the last Poirot we read, that would be 1972's Elephants Can Remember, or if we should read it less literally, merely as if it were taking place at the end of his long career. For me, the obvious answer is to be less literal, because if we're literal, then, as many people have pointed out, Poirot has to be at least 115 years old in this book. He was a retired member of the Belgian police force when he first appeared in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. So that means he was 60-ish in 1920. It is now 55 years later in 1975. 60 plus 55 equals 115, which also equals absurd. There are also all sorts of other continuity issues with this literal take, such as the fact that Hastings got married shortly after 1923's The Murder on the Links, and yet his youngest daughter, Judith, is 21. That means Hastings and his wife had Judith about 30 years into their marriage. Even assuming that Cinderella, Hastings' wife, was 20 when they married, that means she was 50 when Judith was born. So unless IVF was invented a whole lot earlier than I believe it was, that's rather hard to swallow. I'm going to do what I so often do on this podcast in general, and on this episode in particular, and quote from John Curran now. There is no indication on any of the original typescripts of any major deletions or updating, putting paid to the theory that the resurrected manuscript received major surgery to remove obvious chronological anomalies. If you accept that the book was written many years prior to publication and treat it as a lost case, then these problems disappear, and it is possible to enjoy this masterwork of plotting for what it is, the ultimate Christie conjuring trick. Here, John Curran, I agree. And also, I've made this point before, but time need not go at the same speed in the Poirot-verse as it does in our own world, even though sometimes it undoubtedly does. And consistency as to time, or quite frankly anything else, was never Christie's strong suit anyway. In fact, if anything, I think the gaping amount of time between the writing of this manuscript and when it was published is a testament to Christie's personal constitution, her work ethic, and her skill as a writer, given that she was actively writing new Poirot cases for a full 3+ decades after writing Curtain. When she did write Curtain, she probably envisioned that Poirot's final case would come out 10, maybe 20 years later, but certainly not 35. And more power to her for underestimating herself, I say. Okay, so there's one more issue I need to discuss before I begin summarizing this novel. I promise we're almost there, listeners. We're so close. And that has to do with Agatha Christie's own mortality. It's something I haven't fully discussed yet on the podcast. I said in my Sleeping Murder episode that I was saving this topic for Curtain, since this is a book that is so focused on issues of mortality and failing health. And this isn't a fun topic, but I think it's important to get a sense of where Christie was in her own life when this book was published. And of course, this book was the final book to be published in her lifetime. So it was in October of 1974 that Agatha Christie had a heart attack. And how ironic that is, that she ended up plagued by the same ailment that she gave to her fictional detective years earlier in this very book. And it was then 2 months later in December of 1974 that she fell into a French window at her estate of Winterbrook, which is where she spent her winters and where she did the bulk of her work, actually, especially later in her life. And she badly split her head, per Janet Morgan, who goes on to write, "She sat in bed in her silk nightdress, her hair blood-caked, a sad figure now." Oh, that is like such a terrible image. It really makes me sad to think of the elderly Dame Agatha in that condition. Continuing now with Janet Morgan, "The drug she took for her heart had shrunk her into a little scrap, and she ate only a very little. Frail, she remained the good sport she had been in Syria and Iraq, tottering to Wimbledon with Max and managing to attend the Lord Mayor's dinner. In July," this is July of 1975 now, Max persuaded her to come to the polling station to vote in the referendum on Britain's membership in the European community. This is something I referenced during my Passenger to Frankfurt episode with Sophie Hanna, that despite her distrust of certain international alliances, she actually voted for Britain to remain in the EEC, per Max's urging. Back to Morgan. She also kept up the running argument with Billy, that would be Billy Collins, over covers, this time for the jacket of Collins's recent volume of short stories, Poirot's Early Cases. He was a little man, she protested. His smartly dressed lower half seems entirely unlike him and represents him as 6 feet high at least. I never remember him as prone to carry a little bag. She had been upset, too, by the choice of stories for inclusion in this collection, although these had been explicitly cleared. By now, her mind was fuzzy. Fragile and immensely aged, Agatha became, as the very old sometimes do, more and more like the child she had been over 80 years before. Sometimes she was serene, sitting quietly at luncheon with friends, gently leafing through one of her books. "Stop it, Agatha," Max once said as he caught her looking speculative. At other times she was eccentric, declaring, for instance, that today she would wear all her brooches, from the grandest diamonds to small ornaments children had sent her. She was often difficult, frequently upset by the indignities and dependence of her state. Once, to the horror of her family and friends, she seized the scissors and cut off locks of the fine hair of which she had been so proud. Then she would be calm again, resting in the garden in the sun, asking repeatedly for a sun hat and bemusedly finding she had it on. She could be as interesting and quick-witted as ever. From time to time, she still pounced on an idea for a plot. One old friend visiting the house at the end of Agatha's life explained that she gave a shine to her decanters by rinsing them in stearident. She noticed how Agatha immediately fixed on this remark as a possible device for a story. One of Agatha's few expeditions was to the premiere of Murder on the Orient Express. Agatha was impressed by the lavish production and thought Albert Finney a convincing Poirot, apart from his feeble mustache. Otherwise, she was unconverted. And we also know that she attended this premiere in a wheelchair, though she insisted on getting out of it and remaining standing for the Queen. The last outing was to the annual Mousetrap party. Agatha now needed a great deal of looking after. Her bed at Wallingford was moved downstairs, and Max, writing his own memoirs, left the sanctuary of his library for an uncomfortable chair beside her. Neighbors and friends would sit with her, and a night nurse was engaged, but Agatha wasn't happy at being so intimately cared for by a relative stranger, and once more the work of attending her fell to Max and the family. Barbara Parker, who had so efficiently looked after things at Nimrod, came at weekends to give Max some rest. Friends came to sit with Agatha. Delirious, she talked of preparations and journeys, going to find Max, traveling to Cambridge, bringing ladders to fetch down trunks, packing for the children. Now she turned to her memorial. Months before, she had addressed an envelope to Max or Rosalind, adding later, or Matthew. Inside was the instruction, "Put on my slate, sleep after toil, port after stormy seas, ease after war, death after life doth greatly please." She asked for Bach Air and D from Third Suite, played at my funeral, please. Also Nimrod from the Elgar Variations, Matthew to arrange. She actually made a typo here and wrote Nimrud, which is a charming and understandable typo, given that Nimrud was the ancient Assyrian archaeological site where Max Mallowan worked at the height of his career and where Christie regularly accompanied him. In another envelope, she again gave the quote from Spenser, adding a phrase from the Psalms. "In thy presence is the fullness of joy," with the words, "I would like these two things put on my tombstone. Agatha Mallowan." That winter, Agatha caught a cold. "I'm joining my maker," she murmured, and on January 12th of the year 1976, just after luncheon, she died at Winterbrook. Within hours, the invasion began. The local, national, and foreign press appeared in Wallingford. The telephone rang incessantly. Max was inundated with telegrams and letters from the family and personal friends, which he answered within the day, official tributes and requests that were sometimes in poor taste, an American company wanting to market a commemorative Hercule Poirot mustache mug, or well-meaning but idiotic, like a letter from some quasi-lunatic who would like to handle all Agatha's records, Max told Cork. Agatha was buried wearing her wedding ring, as she had asked, at Chalsey, the little church near Winterbrook. The service was private, a small reunion on a chill January day for Agatha's family and a handful of close friends. In May, there was a memorial service at St. Martin in the Fields with the music she had requested, the 23rd Psalm, and a reading from Thomas à Kempis, the book she kept by her bedside. Billy Collins, unwell himself, delivered an address. And that is the end of that. But fortunately, even though we are at the end of Agatha Christie's own life, we are still at the beginning of the book that we have to discuss today, even though we are many, many minutes into this episode. And you can probably tell that I just don't want this episode to end, so I apologize in advance for the gargantuan length of this episode, listeners, but I hope that you are still here along with me on this longest and last ride. So one last time now, let's talk about Curtin, Poirot's last case, and we will begin by running down our list of victims for this book. And when it comes to victims, Curtin really does not disappoint. There is no question that this book has the most victims of any Christie book, since each murder that takes place in it involves two victims, the person murdered and the person who did the murdering. Don't worry, we will get there if that makes no sense to you. And since there are 5 cases Poirot mentions as having happened before the story starts, by the most generous count possible, you could argue there are 18 victims in this story. Have no fear, I am not going to go through 18 names right now. Let's just keep things simple and stick to the people who actually die in the course of this story. There are 3 of them. First up, we have Barbara Babs Franklin, who is about 30 and has big brown eyes, hair parted in the center, and a long, gentle face. She is the invalid wife of the brilliant scientist, Dr. Franklin, and she is one of those malingering characters in Christie, a supposedly ill person who is probably not as ill as she claims. And yet Barbara dies a horrible death ingesting the poison physostigmine in a cup of coffee. Next, we have Stephen Norton, a gray-haired man slightly built who has a boyish, eager face. He also has a limp and a slight stutter and an avid interest in bird watching, which is why he's often found with a pair of field glasses, aka binoculars, around his neck. But is that the only reason why? Poor Stephen is found dead of a gunshot wound to the head, not in the temple, but in the very center of his forehead. He seems to have killed himself for some reason, but did he? And finally, and oh, how it pains me to have to say this, we have Hercule Poirot himself, whose heart, like Christie's, has become extremely weak in his old age, and he dies of heart failure, seemingly succumbing to natural causes. Let's run through some suspects, and I'm happy to say, for old time's sake, that it is everyone. We are, of course, in a country house estate here, in the original country house estate of Styles, in the Essex village of Styles St. Mary. So everyone in this more or less closed circle mystery is a suspect. First up, we have Dr. Franklin, the husband of our victim, Mrs. Franklin, and we always have to suspect the husband, of course. Dr. Franklin is a tall, angular young man of 35 with a decided jaw, reddish hair, and bright blue eyes. And he's very much the absent-minded professor type, always knocking into things. He literally apologizes to pieces of furniture when he bumps into them. And he's a brilliant scientist. His work does get discussed in the course of the novel, but spoiler, it's not really relevant to the mystery. So I'll just say here that it has to do with the Calabar bean, which is a plant that grows in the tropical regions of Africa, and which contains the alkaloids physostigmine, yes, you just heard that word, and esserine, among others. The Calabar bean is extremely poisonous, and it was traditionally used in trials by ordeal in Africa. So if you ate it and you died, it meant you were guilty. But if you ate it and you lived, it meant that you were innocent. And I encourage you all to read Catherine Harkup's book, A is for Arsenic, The Poisons of Agatha Christie, if you want to learn more about how and why some people eat this bean and live, while others eat it and die. But Christie's explanation for this phenomenon, which is totally fictional, is that there is a second species of bean that contains an additional substance that counteracts the poisonous alkaloids, meaning anyone who eats this second type of bean will live. Dr. Franklin is currently trying to isolate this mysterious substance in the second type of Calabar bean and using rats and guinea pigs and whatnot as his test subjects. But what he really wants to do is go to Africa and engage in research out there on the spot. But his wife's delicate health prevents him from doing this, which sounds a whole lot like a motive for murder to me. Also, he has some pretty garbage views of humanity that edge uncomfortably close to eugenics, which we will definitely talk more about later. Next up is Captain Hastings, and oh, how it warms my heart to be able to say that we can technically suspect Captain Hastings of murder here, because he is a character in this story, and not just any character, but our first-person narrator. We are back to a Hastings-narrated Poirot story, which is so appropriate and so poignant for our final Poirot outing. I am in heaven here. And our next suspect is the daughter of Captain Hastings, Judith Hastings. Judith is 21 years old, and she is the assistant to Dr. Franklin. And here's how Hastings describes her, though he admits before doing so that, quote, "I've always been a poor hand at description." And I like to think that Christie's poking fun at herself here, since, as I've mentioned many times on this podcast, physical descriptions of people are definitely not Christie's forte. Hastings writes, "Judith is tall, she holds her head high, she has level dark brows and a very lovely line of cheek and jaw severe in its austerity. She is grave and slightly scornful, and to my mind there has always hung about her a suggestion of tragedy." Not that I really have a sense of Rosalind Hicks, formerly Pritchard, nay Christie, but having done this for as long as I have been doing at this point, I kind of do feel like I have a sense of her. And not only does this physical description match her quite well, but I feel like the personality description also maps on her. Also, Rosalind was born in 1919, so like Judith, she would have been 21 or so around the time Christie was writing this, which again was 1940-ish. So Judith has brains and beauty, which is something a few characters in this story find it hard to wrap their heads around. She also maybe shares her boss's garbage views on the expendability of humanity, but again, more on this later. Next up is Colonel Luttrell, a very tall, attenuated old man with a cadaverous face, mild blue eyes, and a habit of irresolutely tugging at his little white mustache. He is the husband of the husband-wife pair who have taken over Styles and turned it into a guest house, which they seem to be running with some success, though with lots of angst, especially on the colonel's part, as his wife is a bit hard on him. To use a phrase that's stuck in its time, but one a few of the characters in this story would definitely use, he is the proverbially henpecked husband. Next is Daisy Luttrell, who is the colonel's wife, and she looks a little like Miss Marple, quite honestly, from Hastings's description of her. A frail elderly lady with an abundance of curly white hair, pink cheeks, and a pair of cold, pale blue eyes that were widely at variance with the easy geniality of her manner. Hastings finds Mrs. Luttrell a bit too gushy, especially given the flint-like hardness that lies underneath this gushy exterior. Next is Elizabeth Cole, another house guest who seems sad and faded with some sort of a tragic past. Per Hastings, she is a still handsome woman of 33 or 4. Good to know that she managed to preserve her looks at the advanced age of 33 or 34. Later, he calls her handsome in a hag-ridden kind of way. Oh, Hastings. Next is Nurse Craven. This is the nurse who attends on Mrs. Franklin, a tall, good-looking young woman with a fine color and a handsome head of auburn hair. So you know Captain Hastings is a fan. He really does love those auburn-haired ladies. I wish I had more to say about Nurse Craven, but I really do not. Next is Major Allerton, another house guest, a good-looking man in the early 40s, broad-shouldered, bronzed of face, with an easy way of talking, most of what he said holding a double implication. He had the pouches under his eyes that come with a dissipated way of life. Definitely sounds suspicious. Our next suspect is Sir William Boyd Carrington, also a house guest. He is an old-school baronet of the booming what variety. Hastings, of course, loves him. He was governor of a province in India, which is another clue that we aren't in 1975 here, as he seems to be 50-something, and given that India gained its independence nearly 30 years prior to 1975, that would make the math concerning his governorship rather difficult. We're almost done here, people, with our suspects. The next one is Curtis, and that is Poirot's new valet, as according to Poirot, his faithful George has left him to take care of his ill father. The new valet, Curtis, is a big man with a bovine, rather stupid face. And then, such is the curious nature of this story that I actually have to include our victims as suspects as well. That's right, we cannot eliminate Mrs. Franklin, Stephen Norton, or Poirot himself as suspects in this story for the many murders and attempted murders that take place in it. So let's just keep them in mind. And I also just want to note here, now that we have gone through all of our suspects, that this is not an assemblage of complete strangers. We are not in and then there were none territory here. Rather, this is a collection of people who live near each other and who all know each other somewhat well, or at least glancingly, and who have lots of friends and acquaintances in common. I just want to note that because this will become significant fairly soon as we head on into the world as it appears to be, and Oh, Catherine and I have gushed about so many of Christie's stellar openings in so many of the books we've covered on this podcast, but this might be my favorite opening yet, because we are back inside the somewhat dim and cramped but always cozy confines of our dear Captain Hastings' head. And furthermore, we are taking the very same trip with him to that Essex country house named Styles that we took in Christie's very first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. I'm just going to read out the opening lines because they are a gorgeous way to open the story. Who is there who has not felt a sudden startled pang at reliving an old experience or feeling an old emotion? I have done this before. Why do those words always move one so profoundly? That was the question I asked myself as I sat in the train watching the flat Essex landscape outside. How long ago was it that I had taken this selfsame journey, had felt ridiculously that the best of life was over for me, wounded in that war that for me would always be the war that was wiped out now by a second and a more desperate war? It had seemed in 1916 to young Arthur Hastings that he was already old and mature. How little had I realized that, for me, life was only then beginning. I had been journeying, though I did not know it, to meet the man whose influence over me was to shape and mold my life. Actually, I had been going to stay with my old friend, John Cavendish, whose mother, recently remarried, had a country house named Styles. A pleasant renewing of old acquaintanceships, that was all I had thought it, not foreseeing that I was shortly to plunge into all the dark embroilments of a mysterious murder. Just fabulous. Hastings, we learn, is coming to Styles again because Poirot has asked him to join him there. It seems that Styles was sold off by the Cavendish family and is now the property of a Colonel and Mrs. Luttrell, who were badly off and bought Styles as a venture, taking in paying guests. And this is a situation very reminiscent of the one in The Mousetrap, for anyone who has read or seen it. And in this way, it's a very classic Christie setup. Hastings is free to do what he pleases because his poor wife, Cinderella, has died out in Argentina, seemingly while she was still rather young. As he mentions, there was, quote, no long drawn-out suffering or feebleness of old age. This is yet another clue that we aren't 55 years distant from the events of The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Poor Hastings is, by his own reckoning, very lonely and unhappy, and looking forward to seeing his dear friend who he hasn't seen for about a year. It seems that Poirot, who is now, quote, almost crippled with arthritis, end quote, went to Egypt recently to try to improve his health, but came back rather worse than better. And Poirot and Hastings do indeed have their reunion, and it's all very touching, which Linda and I will get into when we discuss the series-long characters for this novel. But it doesn't take Poirot long to get down to business, which is this. There is a murderer among the people who are currently staying at Styles. And Poirot knows this because he's been on this murderer's trail for quite some time now. Basically, and this is the first of the two big concepts Christie introduces in this book, the murderer acts by way of inspiring others to commit murder. This murderer, who Poirot calls X, so we shall do the same, intentionally fills the role of catalyst, saying or doing just the right thing to inspire a person who wouldn't have committed the murder on his or her own to do just that. This is why there are really two victims in each of these murderous scenarios, the person murdered and then the person induced to commit murder. Now, whether you buy the believability of this concept goes a long way toward how much this book works for you. We'll see this concept play out, however, a few times over the course of the story. So I'd say let's just reserve judgment for now and get into what happens. Poirot tells Hastings that he knows of 5 previous instances in which X brought about murder in this way. He's even made a précis of these cases, which Hastings reproduces for us in the book. And I'm not going to make too much of them now because we honestly have enough plot to churn through as it is. But briefly, the first case involves a woman who may have poisoned her abusive husband. She was acquitted, but her life was ruined all the same, and she died of an overdose of sleeping draught. The second is a niece who may have poisoned her elderly aunt. The niece says she did it by accident. This case was never brought to trial. The third involves a husband who shot his wife and the man she was having an affair with. He says he must have done it, though he has no memory of doing it. He's tried and convicted, and his sentence of capital punishment is reduced to penal servitude for life. The fourth is a wife who poisons her cheating husband. She breaks down on the witness stand, admits it, gets convicted, and is hanged. That is yet another anachronism to indicate our present day probably isn't 1975, since the last hanging to take place in England was 1964, though of course this case could have been over 10 years old. And then finally, we have an elderly father with 4 daughters who was a tyrant, refusing to allow his daughters to enjoy their lives whatsoever. And I already mentioned the Barretts of Wimpole Street as a reference that connects Sleeping Murder and Curtain, so I feel duty-bound to point out that this scenario is nearly identical to the one in that film, though Christie's version ends a bit differently. The tyrant father is killed by a blow to the head, which his eldest daughter eventually confesses to, saying she did it for the sake of her sisters. And this woman is judged to be insane and committed to Broadmoor, where she dies shortly afterwards. So that is quite a little précis of unpleasant happenings. And in it, we can see the brilliance of this X, if we believe it really is possible to induce people to commit murder. There's no way X would ever be indicated as a key party in any of these situations. There's also, crucially, no way that X could even be charged or otherwise legally reprimanded for his or her role in any of these crimes. So right from the get-go, we can see that if X is going to be punished, it's going to have to be an extra legal punishment. Something I would argue we know Poirot is fully prepared to do if need be. Especially since Poirot is convinced that X is about to strike again among all those assembled here in Styles. Not that Poirot has any idea who the target is or how X will bring about this murder. But this is also why it's so key that all the suspects gathered at Styles know each other. They all come from this general area and they travel in similar circles, so it would be easy to connect any of them to these 5 past cases and for them to be interacting as intimately as they do over the course of the story. Hastings very naturally asks who this X person is, and Poirot, quite naturally for him as he loves torturing poor Hastings, tells him he isn't going to say. The real reason, of course, is that if Poirot told him right away, it would spoil the mystery. But the very convincing cover reason Christie supplies is that Poirot doesn't want Hastings giving the game away. I do not wish, you see, that you should sit staring at X with your mouth hanging open, your face saying plainly, this that I am looking at is a murderer. Oh, Poirot, and oh, Hastings. So Poirot retires to bed after all these revelations, and Hastings goes down to the drawing room, where he plays a round or rubber of bridge, partnering up with Stephen Norton against the Luttrells. And poor Colonel Luttrell is so nervous around his wife, he makes all sorts of dumb mistakes, which only makes his wife angrier at him. And as they're leaving the table, Norton says, "I say, Hastings, that was pretty ghastly. It gets my back up to see that poor old boy bullied like that, and the meek way he takes it. Poor chap. Not much of the peppery-tongued Indian colonel about him." Hastings tells him to quiet down because Norton says this pretty loudly within hearing of the poor colonel, and by this point they've made their way out into the hall. Hastings wonders if they should shut the side door to the garden for the night, but Norton hesitates before saying he doesn't think everyone is in. Specifically, Hastings' daughter Judith and Major Allerton are still out there. And this doesn't sit very well with Hastings, who hates Allerton on sight and worries Judith might be falling for him, as so many women seem to do. So it's no surprise Hastings can't sleep, which leads him to go out into the passage outside his room to knock on Poirot's door. But then he hesitates, not loving the idea of waking Poirot up. And this is when Allerton moseys on down the passage. And Allerton says he'll fix Hastings up. So they go into Allerton's room, where he gets a bottle of Slumberil tablets from his bathroom cupboard. Hastings wonders if this Slumberil is dangerous, and Allerton says, "It is if you take too much of it. It's one of the barbiturates, whose toxic dose is very near the effective one." Good to know. Hastings predictably becomes convinced that Allerton is X. I can now gloss over the events of the next few days in which dubious science is discussed in regard to the Calabar bean and the intrinsic worth of human life. Hastings' burgeoning bromance with Boyd Carrington continues apace, etc., etc. In fact, it almost seems as if Poirot is jealous of Hastings' regard for Carrington. Here's what Poirot says. "Why are you so obsessed with Boyd Carrington? He repeats himself. He tells the same story twice. And what is more, his memory is so bad that he tells back to you the story that you have told to him. A man of outstanding ability? Not at all. An old bore, a windbag. Enfin, the stuffed shirt." Wow, tell us how you really feel, Poirot. Hastings also has a tete-a-tete with Elizabeth Cole, who reveals that she is actually one of the younger sisters from that past case where the oldest sister confessed to killing their cruel father. And she seems very much broken down by the experience, but could she be pretending? Maybe she's X. A little later, Colonel Luttrell, Hastings, Stephen Norton, and Boyd Carrington are chilling out on the veranda, and Norton says he's thirsty, so the colonel goes inside to fetch them some drinks. "Have a drink, you fellows. On the house, what?" But then the colonel's wife finds out what he's about to do, and she just lays into him, saying, "How do you think we'll ever make this place pay if you go round standing everybody drinks?" The colonel tries to fight back, but she is not having it. And who are you, I'd like to know? Who runs this house? I do, and don't you forget it. Oof. This is, of course, supposed to be the utmost humiliation for a man to be lorded, or I guess I should say ladied over by his wife like this. And it's certainly how the poor colonel seems to take it, hobbling out after everyone's overheard this argument and having to pretend they ran out of whiskey. A ridiculous notion for any country house I've ever seen depicted in a murder mystery. Norton starts babbling to cover up the awkwardness, while Hastings notices Mrs. Luttrell walking out of the house with gardening gloves and a dandelion weeder. And Norton just keeps going on and on. He picks up a wood pigeon and talks about how he had been laughed at his prep school for being sick when he saw a rabbit killed, which leads to the subject of grouse moors and a long and rather pointless story of an accident that had occurred in Scotland when a beater had been shot. And then this leads them to talk about various shooting accidents, Boyd Carrington launching into his own story about an Irish batman he knew who shot his own brother in cold blood and was proud of it. He even puts on an Irish accent I'm 100% positive is terrible and pretty offensive to hear. But Norton, Luttrell, and Hastings are all delighted by it. And after Carrington leaves, they talk about what a mensch he is. Well, they definitely don't use that word. And when Hastings suggests Carrington should settle down and marry, Norton laughs and says, "Marry and settle down? And suppose his wife bullies him." And of course, that is a super awkward thing to say, which causes Norton and Hastings to babble even more. But Colonel Luttrell doesn't even notice. He says, in what's described as a queer, inexpressive voice, the following: "No, Boyd Carrington won't get bullied by his wife. He's not the sort of man who lets himself get bullied. He's all right. He's a man." Are you getting a contact burn from all the toxic masculinity here? Because I certainly am. And then the colonel picks up his gun, intent on shooting a wood pigeon, but the bird flies off, at which point the colonel notices a rabbit nibbling the bark of those young fruit trees in the distance. So he fires, and there is a scream in a woman's voice that dies in a kind of horrible gurgle. Turns out the colonel accidentally shot his wife, Daisy, who was out there gardening. But was it truly an accident? Fortunately for Daisy, she was shot in the shoulder, so she's going to be okay. And the colonel feels awful. And what we see is that these two old lovebirds really do very much make up and have a touching reunion post-shooting, which is the kind of sentence one can only say when summarizing an Agatha Christie story. Hastings can't help thinking, though, that if Mrs. Luttrell had died, it would have been exactly like those past 5 cases. And X is clearly at work here. But again, who is X? Hastings still has no clue. Meanwhile, he's keeping tabs on Judith and Allerton, who seem to be getting very chummy. And Hastings is more worried than ever about this, especially after learning from Boyd Carrington that Allerton's wife is a devout Roman Catholic who won't grant him a divorce. God bless these devout Catholics in the Christie-verse. Their refusal to divorce is so very helpful for plotting purposes. Apparently, Allerton is fine with this, as it allows him to fool around with other women to his heart's content. Pleasant hearing for a father, as Hastings says. Poor Hastings also learns from Norton about another girl who Allerton was involved with, who was so destroyed by the experience that she actually ended up killing herself. This sends Hastings into a tailspin, which he blames partially on the evil atmosphere of Styles itself. And he becomes even more convinced that Allerton has to be X, and that he must be stopped before he seriously harms his beloved daughter. So things are pretty bad at this point, but then they get even worse when Hastings goes on a rambling walk with Elizabeth Cole and Norton, during which Norton seems to see something with those field glasses of his, but he refuses to say what or to show Hastings. Hastings is convinced it was Judith and Allerton, and it definitely doesn't help when after dinner he himself witnesses Judith and Allerton snogging. The horror. He's with Norton at the time, who holds Hastings back, telling him there's really nothing he can do about it, as upsetting as all this is. And Hastings writes, "I was silent. He might think that that was so, but I knew better." Hastings then pursues Allerton and Judith, stopping when he hears Allerton making a plan for an assignation in London between him and his lady love. Hastings naturally assumes that Allerton is talking to Judith, since he just saw them kissing, even though he never hears Judith respond to this plan. And Norton actually hurries him away, at which point Hastings begs off, saying he has a headache and that he has to go to bed. And this next sequence in the book is in some ways the most impressive part of the story, because this is when Hastings plots to murder Allerton. And the thing is, it's kind of believable. Christie does a great job here of conveying just how vulnerable Hastings is. He's lost his wife. which is a double whammy because he's still mourning her and he doesn't have her counsel to rely on like he's used to having. Poirot is largely absent because he's often confined to his room. And Hastings is a father, after all, who's worried to death about his daughter and who is believably convinced that Allerton is going to be the ruin of her. If you didn't already realize what's happening here, X is preying on Hastings, doing his or her utmost to turn Hastings into a murderer, and it nearly works. And I think the fact that we believe this sequence of events goes a long way towards selling the central conceit of the novel in terms of X inducing others to commit murder. So because it's Hastings, this attempt to murder Allerton is comically bad. And that too is believable. Hastings goes into Allerton's bathroom and extracts 8 of those Slumberol tablets from their bottle, replacing them with aspirin tablets so that the bottle looks the same. Then he wipes the bottle of all fingerprints and dumps the lethal dose of Slumberol into a glass, which he plans to hand to Allerton when Allerton comes up to go to bed. Hastings is going to pretend he was pouring himself out a drink, and he'll hand Allerton the poison drink and then make a harmless one for himself. And hey presto, dead philanderer. And so Hastings sits and waits for Allerton until there's a knock on the door, and it's Curtis saying that Poirot would like to speak with him. So Hastings goes to Poirot, and he gives Poirot the headache excuse once again so that he can get back to his room ASAP to continue his little murder game. But Poirot is very concerned about this headache, and he forces Hastings to eat what Hastings characterizes as a cup of sweet and wholly disgusting chocolate. And then Hastings goes back to his room and promptly passes out. Oopsie. So that's the bad news. The good news is that in the light of morning, Hastings realizes he was being crazy the night before, and that of course he can't murder Allerton. He's not a murderer. So what we have here now is our attempted murder number 2. First, there was Mrs. Luttrell who almost died, and now Major Allerton has had a close brush with death, though he is none the wiser. And Hastings, of course, tells Poirot everything. And Poirot chastises Hastings, not, for almost murdering a man, but for the clunkiness of his murder attempt. Because, of course, Poirot does. He points out that Hastings wiped not only his, but Allerton's fingerprints off that bottle of Slumberol, which would have led to analyzing the bottle's contents and finding that aspirin, thereby proving that someone had tampered with the bottle. And Hastings, of course, had the most obvious motive. So that was just very silly on Hastings's part. But Hastings defends himself by saying that, in any case, no one could have seen him do anything. Poirot counters this by saying that someone could have been looking through the keyhole of Allerton's bathroom while Hastings was tampering with that bottle. Hastings doesn't believe anyone would actually do that, but Poirot notes that strange things have been happening with keys in this house. His own room key disappeared, for instance, forcing him to have another one made. Poirot also, by the way, gives Hastings excellent personal advice. He tells him simply to trust Judith to do the right thing. Judith, says Poirot, is made of very fine stuff. I admire her very much. Oh, Poirot, he really has become wise in his old age. And lo and behold, Judith remains at Styles on this day. She does not leave to go to London and have a tryst with Allerton after all. And this is curious and very much a side plot, so I will just solve it now. The woman Allerton was talking to when Hastings overheard him outside was actually the comely Nurse Craven, not Judith. Judith doesn't give a fig about Allerton, but she clearly cares about someone, so who is it? Well, Hastings might be the only one at Styles not to know who Judith cares about, but we shall get confirmation on this front very soon, because later that day, Mrs. Franklin invites everyone to her room for coffee, dressed in, I love this, a negligee of pale eau de Nil lying on her chaise longue. And eau de Nil is a shade of green, as in water of the Nile, in case you didn't know. I did not know that. I had to look that word up. So I'm definitely picturing something here along the lines of Blanche Devereaux or Joan Collins as Mrs. Franklin lounges in her negligee, pouring out delicate berry-scented Java for her guests. And this all has an echo of Styles, of course, where there was a big coffee drinking scene that turned out to be important. And this one is important as well, because later that night, Mrs. Franklin dies a violent death, having been poisoned by way of her coffee cup with physostigmine, one of the alkaloids found in that pesky Calabar bean Dr. Franklin and Judith have been studying together so assiduously. And here's the thing. Christie has been very clever from the beginning about seeding in doubts where Judith is concerned. And naturally, we realized long before Hastings that the man Judith is in love with is not Major Allerton, but is in fact her boss, Dr. Franklin. An assistant falling in love with her boss in a Christie novel? Never. And even though Daddy Dearest is totally clueless, it seems as though perhaps Judith is X, or maybe Dr. Franklin is X, or at the very least, perhaps one or both of them was induced by X to murder Mrs. Franklin so they could be together. And horrible thought, but is this the real reason Poirot summoned Hastings in the first place? Maybe poor Hastings has to come to terms with the fact that his daughter needs to be put away, and this was the most humane way Poirot could think to do it. Maybe. But fortunately, we are in a classic Christie puzzle mystery here, so we do not have to guess. We have a bridge of clues to lead us to the solution, so let's step on that bridge right now with clue number 1. Before anything has really happened in this story, and Hastings has merely met the assembled guests at Styles, Poirot asks him who he thinks X might be. And this is what Hastings says. I had considered Norton. Not that I've anything to go upon. He just struck me as perhaps less unlikely than anyone else. And then he's, well, inconspicuous. I should imagine the kind of murderer we're after would have to be inconspicuous. And the deduction here, listeners, is that we should always trust our instincts, especially if we're a bit of a dodo like Hastings. We don't always make the best logical deductions. Also, later on, just before Mrs. Franklin drinks that fatal cup of coffee, Hastings tells us that suddenly, from nowhere, a vague feeling of uneasiness and disquiet assailed me. Hastings goes on to describe this feeling to Boyd Carrington as, quote, a feeling that something was going to happen, which very much put me in mind of the early Christie short story, The Red Signal. And of course, Hastings is borne out by what happens to Mrs. Franklin after he gets this feeling. So perhaps his instincts about Norton were also correct? Clue number 2. Norton's oh-so-casual and glancing mention of having been laughed at in prep school for being sick when he saw a rabbit killed. The deduction here is, isn't this exactly the sort of humiliating formative experience we might expect in the early life of a cold-blooded murderer who takes pleasure in forcing other people to do bad things? The glancing nature of the reference should also make us very suspicious. The way this fact is presented, it's not quite a laundry list, but it's definitely laundry list adjacent. All right, clue number 3, and this has to do with catalysts. And I will be honest, this is the main clue of the novel. It's the crucial clue, because if X really does work as a catalyst, if he or she induces others to commit murder, then this story must be peppered with instances of one particular character saying or doing things to egg on other characters. And the deduction here is that the story is indeed peppered with such instances of one character saying or doing things to egg on other characters. It's just that Christie is so good at hiding these clues in plain sight, we have to do a little bit of work to see them. And this is where we lose some of Christie's craft in summing up the novel, because it was probably much more obvious as you listen to me just now who this person is than it is while reading the actual book. But here's just a partial list of moments I extracted while I was reading. Norton speaking loudly about Colonel Luttrell getting bullied, loud enough for the Colonel to overhear. Norton informing Hastings that Major Allerton and Judith are out late at night. Norton asking the Colonel for a drink, which leads to that humiliating moment in which his wife forbids him to treat his paying guests to a drink. Norton practically taunting Judith that she would never engage in euthanasia if presented with the opportunity. Norton apparently seeing something through his field glasses that will upset Hastings, though we never get confirmation he actually did see anything, which in a Christie novel means he was lying, of course. Boyd Carrington bringing up that story of the Irish batman who shot his brother right after we've been told Carrington has a habit of repeating other people's stories and co-opting them for himself, because this is also right after Norton tells his own story about an accidental shooting. And an astute reader will deduce from all this that Norton is feeding stories to Carrington, which he knows will be repeated, thereby adding fuel to the fire that eventually results in Luttrell shooting his own wife. I love this one because it brings Boyd Carrington into the mix, but Christie really does play fair here because she has put us on notice that Boyd Carrington simply repeats other people's stories. Very wicked and clever of her. Do we really need more than this? There definitely are more examples, but you shouldn't need more. Norton has to be X, listeners. There are just too many instances of him providing that crucial moment that sends one of the other characters over the edge and into a murderous act. All right, let's talk about the world as it actually is. We know what happened with Colonel Luttrell, who was goaded into shooting his wife, and with Captain Hastings, who was nearly goaded into poisoning Major Allerton. But what gives with the Mrs. Franklin situation? Did she really die by suicide, as Poirot testifies at her inquest? She did not. Though before I explain what happened to her, I do have to highlight this moment that happens right after Mrs. Franklin's funeral, when an old woman who was around at the time of the first Styles murder all those years ago approaches Hastings and notes that, "It's queer you should be there both times, sir, isn't it now?" And then Hastings tells us, "For one fantastic moment, I wondered if she suspected me of having really committed both crimes. It was most disturbing. It certainly made me realize what a queer, haunting thing local suspicion is." This, of course, would be the "I killed them all" Jessica Fletcher conspiracy theory that explains all those grisly murders in Cabot Cove over the years. Catherine loved to bring up this theory whenever possible, so I felt like I had to do that now in her honor. Just couldn't let that moment pass us by. So what gives with Mrs. Franklin? Well, Hastings is convinced that X was finally successful, that Mrs. Franklin is X's latest victim, which is why the news that Dr. Franklin and his own daughter Judith are going to get married before they head out to Africa to get their Calabar bean on is very distressing to him. Did Judith and Dr. Franklin murder Mrs. Franklin? Something also seems to be eating Stephen Norton. And if we're astute readers, we know it's because X finally managed to produce a dead body at Styles, except that he didn't get his second victim in the form of the person who's either convicted or suspected, at the very least, of having murdered the first victim, since Mrs. Franklin's death is deemed a suicide, based in large part on Poirot's testimony at the inquest. The not astute Hastings has no idea that Norton is X, of course, so Hastings suggests that Norton go see Poirot, which he does. And Hastings leaves these two alone for their cozy little chat, not checking on Poirot before he goes to bed because it's late by then and he doesn't want to wake Poirot, what with his health being as delicate as it is. Our dear Belgian detective's got to get his Z's, after all. And Hastings himself is just dropping off when he's woken by a sound. And he looks out into the corridor where he sees Norton from behind, coming out of the bathroom and going into his own room, his hair sticking up as it often does, and his bathrobe easily recognizable. It has a checked pattern and a, quote, hideous coloring, end quote. And then he hears Norton lock himself into his room. Cool. Except not so cool, because the next day Norton is discovered in his bedroom, still in his dressing gown, dead with a gunshot wound directly in the center of his forehead. And the door is still locked. The key to the door is in Norton's pocket, and the windows in the room are shuttered. So this would be a late-breaking locked room mystery, because even though this might look like a suicide, Poirot is very clear when Hastings rushes to give him the news that, quote, Norton did not shoot himself. He was deliberately killed, end quote. But hold on. Norton is X. He's our uber villain. So who could have possibly killed him? Well, fortunately, we have a second bridge o' clues to get us further along into the world as it actually is. A bonus bridge for our final outing. This is so exciting. All right, clue number 1 of our second bridge. Norton is seen from afar in a dressing gown when Hastings sees him down the hallway. And the deduction here is, as Poirot himself says, ma foi, anyone can wear a dressing gown. This puts me in mind of Murder on the Orient Express, though I won't get any more specific for fear of spoilers. We obviously can't make an assumption about a man seen from behind from a distance in a Christie story. Come on. This means the man Hastings sees down the corridor can't actually be Norton. But hold on again. Clue number 2. Norton is 5'5", and all the other men, all the other people really in this story are taller than him. You may have noticed in my character descriptions that an unusual number of people were described as tall, and this is why. Because the deduction here has to do with height. And oh, how I love this clue, because really it's a meta clue. And that we all know from the canon that precedes this book that there is one man at Styles who is shorter than the 5'5" Norton. That, of course, would be the 5'4" Poirot, who notes in his letter to Hastings at the end, it is comparatively easy with raised heels or elevators in the shoes to add to one's height. Clue number 3, but what about that wheeled chair? Isn't Poirot incapable of walking? And we get our deduction a little later in the book, but Poirot directs Hastings to seek out his old valet, George, who informs Hastings that his father is feeling fine. It was Poirot who dismissed him, replacing George for the seemingly dim-witted Curtis. And an astute reader just may be able to reason from this that Poirot needed someone who didn't know him very well and who wouldn't ask questions so that he could successfully pretend not to be able to walk. And I just have to know that, yes, Linda and I will get into the problematic ableism exhibited in this clue and in other parts of the book when we discuss depictions stuck in their time in the rankings portion of the episode. That is yet to come. Clue number 4. Poirot's casual reference to his disappearing key. I was extremely proud of myself for picking up on this, especially since I hadn't remembered it from my initial read decades earlier, or at least I don't think I remembered it. And the deduction here is that, well, of course, Poirot made his key disappear on purpose so that he could have a copy made and thereby have 2 copies of the same key. And combining this deduction with the fact that Poirot changed rooms, as he tells Hastings, and that he arrived at Styles before Norton, a super astute reader should be able to figure out that Norton's room was Poirot's old room, meaning Poirot had a second key to Norton's room and was able to simply lock the door from the outside with that second key after he killed Norton. Clue number 5, and I'm really saving the best for last here. Norton supposedly shot himself in the exact center of his forehead rather than in his temple like people normally do when shooting themselves in the head. Our deduction is that even the surgeon at the inquest for Norton says that this was strange, because it really is. Only one who is so OCD he can't bear any asymmetricality in, say, pairs of boiled eggs presented to him at breakfast, or head wounds, it would seem, would insist on shooting a person in the center of the forehead. And we are back now in the world as it actually is, because this, of course, is the second big concept lying at the heart of this book. The idea that Christie, who has had so many brilliant permutations as to blank did it, wows us one more time, because the solution here is that Poirot did it, people. Poirot. It's just so shocking. Also, I love how the solution hinges on Poirot being way more active than we think he is. It's like Christie's final bluff, capitalizing on how inconsistent she is about Poirot as an armchair detective. I've gone on and on about that over the course of this podcast. We saw Poirot be quite active in the mysterious affair at Styles, and then so many of his other mysteries. Early on in this very book, Poirot tells Hastings, "My rule, remember, has been always the same. Sit back and think." And I wrote in my margin, kind of. But Christie was playing with me here, because Poirot himself is lying about how active he can and will be in the course of this investigation. He is going to think, but he is not going to sit back. It's just brilliant. Of course, Hastings can't figure any of this out for himself, and that is a true pity, because soon after this conversation between Hastings and Poirot about Norton being murdered, Poirot is found dead, having finally succumbed to his heart problems. The medication he used to alleviate his symptoms wasn't by his bedside like it usually was, so horror of horrors, could Poirot himself have been murdered? Well, no, because if we're astute readers, we know at this point that Norton is X and that Poirot executed him, essentially. So the only real question is whether by not taking his medication, Poirot helped induce his own demise to a significant enough degree that it could be deemed suicide. That is really an open question, and one that I think we could debate for a while. I'd love to hear from all of you about it, actually, if you have any thoughts on the matter. Poirot, of course, takes pity on poor Hastings eventually. 4 months after his death, Hastings receives a manuscript in the mail, in which Poirot pulls off his longest denouement yet. I love, by the way, how this is such an intimate form of the grand drawing room denouement, which Christie first established in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Here we simply have one friend speaking to the other from across the grave, and I think it's a really fitting final denouement. I also love that we finally get to hear Poirot's own voice, which I don't believe has ever happened before, at least not in such a sustained way. We do get Miss Marple narrating a story, and Miss Marple tells a story, but never Poirot, and I think it's satisfying that we get it here at the very end. So I've already gone through how Norton and then Poirot pulled off these murders, except that I should mention Poirot makes a big deal out of these 2 plays he leaves for Hastings as clues. The first is Othello by Shakespeare, which Christie references in several of her stories. And the second is John Ferguson by St. John Ervine, a lesser known play, or at least lesser known to me. I have to be very humble about such things after not picking up on the Duchess of Malfi reference in Sleeping Murder. The thing is, Poirot already explained to Hastings and to us at the beginning of the story the very Iago-like way that X pulled off his plot. So for me, this was a pretty repetitive clue, and I didn't find it to be all that helpful or significant. But we know Christie loves a play-based clue or two, so I just wanted to note it. The only mystery yet to be cleared up is what the heck happened with Mrs. Franklin, and hold on to your hats because it's a bit of a doozy. Turns out she was attempting to kill her husband so that she could marry Boyd Carrington. And to give Christie her due, I left this out of my summary, but the book is littered with allusions to and depictions of the affection and attraction between Mrs. Franklin and Boyd Carrington, who have known each other for a long time, since they were quite young. Remember, all these assembled guests are rather well acquainted, these two in particular. So Christie is absolutely playing fair here, as she always does. So it was Mrs. Franklin who put the physostigmine in the coffee cup intended for Dr. Franklin, but then Hastings inadvertently switched the cups when he turned a revolving bookcase around in the room. Oops! Though he did inadvertently save the life of his future son-in-law. Yes, this is all a little goofy, but it's also a surprising twist that Mrs. Franklin's death was both accidental and caused by her own actions, and I always appreciate being surprised by the twisty-turny Christie. X had in fact been hard at work on Mrs. Franklin, just as he was on pretty much anyone and everyone in Styles. But once again, X did not quite succeed. Also, Poirot finally tells Hastings why he invited him to Styles. And even though I like to think it was partly because Poirot knew he was going to die and he wanted to say goodbye to his dear friend, the reason Poirot supplies is pretty brutal. I'm quoting now from his manuscript. I had to have someone who accepted what I said without question. In other words, Hastings functioned as a second Curtis, a stupid attendant who would believe whatever Poirot said and not ask questions. I've said this before, and I'm going to say it one last time. The Poirot of the books can actually be pretty brutal, much more brutal than Suchet's Poirot, especially when it comes to Hastings. And this is yet one more example here at the very end of the book. All right, a few more notes to wrap up. Poirot actually was looking in at the keyhole of Allerton's bathroom when Hastings was fiddling with that bottle of Slumberil. And Poirot, of course, put sleeping tablets in the cup of chocolate he forced Hastings to drink, which is why Hastings passed out before he could poison Allerton. Poirot also drugged Norton, so he is a serial drugger in this story. He tells Hastings in his letter that when Norton came to his room, most likely with some trumped-up story about Judith and Dr. Franklin that he was trying to use to fasten suspicion on them for having killed Mrs. Franklin, Poirot told him the jig was up. He knew everything, and this is what Poirot writes in his manuscript. He did not deny it. No, mon ami. He sat back in his chair and smirked. Mais oui, there is no other word for it. He smirked. He asked me what I thought I was going to do about this amusing idea of mine. I told him that I proposed to execute him. Wow. Norton very understandably asks Poirot to switch cups of chocolate with him at this point, which Poirot does happily because Poirot has officially become the Dread Pirate Roberts in this moment.
To think, all that time it was Shortcut that was poisoned.
They were both poisoned. I spent the last few years building up an immunity to iocane powder.
It turns out both cups are laced with sleeping pills, and Poirot's built up a tolerance to said sleeping pills. Plus, he can counteract the effect of them with, quote, a dose of my strychnine tonic, which is yet another nod to the mysterious affair at Styles. I love it. And once Norton passes out, Poirot is able to bundle him into his wheeled chair, which he claims is fairly easy. It has many types of mechanism. If you say so, Poirot. And then Poirot proceeds to impersonate Norton for Hastings' sake, putting on his dressing gown, ruffling up the gray hair that Poirot has underneath his black wig. Poirot can even take off his mustache to perfect this impersonation because, quel horror, that is a fake too. Even George does not know that, Poirot writes, and I, of course, immediately thought of Branagh's Death on the Nile, though I won't say why in case you haven't seen it yet. And then Poirot limps from the bathroom to Norton's room in full view of Hastings, just as he intended. The gun that he uses to kill Norton, by the way, is one that Poirot has kept on him all this time, except for two occasions when he leaves it on Norton's dressing table when Norton is out, and when the housemaid will see it, thereby vouching for it as Norton's gun. And that is just brilliant. What a contrast with Hastings's fumbling attempts to commit a murder. I mean, we should all be afraid of Poirot when he sets out to commit a murder, because that is some insane attention to detail right there. In closing, Poirot points out that rather than shooting Norton openly, as he could have done, he could have pretended to have had an accident and just blamed it on his age, after all. He chose to do it this way because he wanted to be sporting. He wanted, in essence, to commit the kind of murder that he spent his career solving, murders that are solvable by way of order and method and logic and deduction. And this is also why he indulges his weakness for symmetry at the end, shooting Norton in the exact center of his forehead. Poirot wonders openly whether Hastings will have figured all this out, writing, "But somehow I do not think so. No, you are too trusting. You have too beautiful a nature." And even though this is incredibly condescending, it also feels like a benediction to me, not just to Hastings, but to all those readers who were never able to figure it out, or who, like me, were rarely able to figure it out, but who loved playing the game anyway. And Poirot ends this manuscript with, but of course, a Papa Poirot moment. He wants Hastings to go to Elizabeth Cole and explain how Stephen Norton influenced people so that she can get over the murder of her father by her older sister and perhaps even move on to a happier life with the lonely Hastings. That's clearly what Poirot wants, and yet this is not one of Christie's happy-go-lucky endings, I would argue. We don't see Hastings with Elizabeth Cole at the end, and I'm not sure that they do end up together. Personally, I think that after Hastings' wife and best friend have died, there just isn't enough left of him to forge a relationship with a new person. And I know that's incredibly sad, but that's just how it reads to me. As for Poirot himself, we can really see him struggling at the end of this manuscript as to whether or not he's done the right thing. He makes an analogy to how, as a young man in the Belgian police force, I shot down a desperate criminal who sat on a roof and fired at people below. But of course, there's an immediacy to that situation that we don't have here. And Poirot, that vain little man who not only knows all, but habitually prides himself on knowing all, very much finds himself at a loss here. Quoting again from his manuscript, "But now I am very humble and I say like a little child, I do not know." And really, what a way to end. I find this ending very poignant, with Poirot questioning himself and having the humility to do so. I should mention that we do get one final moment from Captain Hastings on the other side of Poirot's manuscript, in which he chides himself for not figuring out the solution once he was confronted with that symmetrical bullet wound in Norton's forehead. Such a classic Christie clue because it feels so obvious once we're on the other side of it. Hastings writes, and these are the final lines of the novel, "Queer, it's just come to me, the thought in the back of my mind that morning. The mark on Norton's forehead. It was like the brand of Cain." And yes, this is a little bit of an odd way to end the book, but I do actually find it appropriate as a final moment because it actually ties the book to one of Christie's very best, And Then There Were None, which also ends with the notion of a bullet wound on one's forehead being interpreted as a brand of Cain and marking one out as a murderer. Let's not forget that Christie must have been writing both these books around the same time. This is something that John Curran alludes to in his study of Agatha Christie's notebooks, but I have to credit my previous co-host, Tony Medawar, who joined me to rank Sleeping Murder, for making me think more deeply about the connections between these two books, Curtain and Then There Were None. Tony has a theory, actually, that Christie often wrote two books at once, side by side, as it were, which we know she did do with NRM and The Body in the Library, for instance. And in the same way, he was able to draw so many shocking similarities between 450 from Paddington and Sleeping Murder. He pointed out to me over the phone the other day, because that's what Christie enthusiasts do. We call each other up and talk about Christie. He pointed out that it's not just the mark of Cain at the end that connects these two books. Fast forward if you haven't yet read And Then There Were None, but both books begin with a man arriving on a train, Justice Wargrave in And Then There Were None, Hastings in Curtain, both of whom go on to play a role in at least one of the deaths to take place in their respective stories, though perhaps Wargrave is a touch more witting in this respect than Hastings. And they both end with a long letter in which a murderer who has very literally taken the law into his hands confesses and then explains how he did it. As Tony and I discussed in our Sleeping Murder episode, these sorts of connections can be made between so many of Christie's novels, which is one of the many ways her brilliance shines through when we read these books as closely as Catherine and I have done on this podcast. And that really comforts me to think of all the wonderful books Christie had yet to write when she wrote these final words in this final moment of her final Poirot novel, referencing the very first murderer in the world. The end. Knock, knock. It's BritBox calling. You are all well aware at this point that I am a longtime BritBox subscriber. I've already talked about all the Agatha Christie content they have. I have raved about a few of my other favorites like Father Brown and Sister Boniface and Vera. But did you know that BritBox is adding new content all the time? Programs like the latest season of MacDonald and Dodds, an English detective series set in Bath, I'm a big fan of Bath, actually. It's such a great setting for a mystery series because it's such a specific city. I have fond memories of visiting there and touring the Roman baths, the titular Roman baths, I guess I should say. Anyway, MacDonald and Dodds is very much built on the Odd Couple model, in which our two detectives, MacDonald and Dodds, have very different approaches to investigating murder. For me, it has a little bit of a Morsian flair, actually, which is, of course, a high compliment. So go check it out, or any of the other offerings to be plucked from the mystery horn of plenty, that is BritBox. And if you're in the US or Canada, you can get 50% off the first month of your monthly subscription if you use the coupon code Agatha at checkout. So don't wait. Go to BritBox.com now and start luxuriating in the cornucopia of mysteries that awaits. Okay, it's time to talk about the one adaptation we have for this book. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, I'd just like to point out that Curtain came out at an interesting time in terms of film adaptations of Christie's work. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, it was published directly in the shadow of the great success of the star-studded Murder on the Orient Express film, and there were great plans to do future Poirot novels in this grand style. And of course, there were future Poirot novels adapted, Death on the Nile and Evil Under the Sun, specifically. As Mark Aldridge tells us in Agatha Christie on Screen, the juxtaposition of Poirot's final story with a potential new series of films was noted. Interest had been expressed in adapting Curtain as a film, but Christie's agents and family, including her daughter, Rosalind Hicks, felt that this was not a desirable move. As a result, it was suggested that Agatha Christie Limited, the family company that controlled most of Christie's work since the 1950s, could buy the film rights itself from Hicks, to whom Christie had gifted the rights to her final novel, in order to ensure that they were not made available in any separate deal, although the likelihood of Hicks doing such a thing was not high. Clearly, any such film would not only have the standard artistic issues to confront, but would probably put Poirot on film to bed for many years. Rather than capitalizing directly on the commercial and critical success of Curtain, it was decided to continue Poirot's appearances on screen in a manner that would be rather less final. Although apparently there were whispers of selling the rights in a way that would allow John Brabourne, who produced Murder on the Orient Express, to make the film as a final part of a Poirot trilogy. And that would have been super interesting. A Finney or Ustinov spin on Curtain, done with that splashy 70s flair. But alas, it was not to be. And it wasn't until our beloved Suchet series was drawing to a close that an adaptation of this book became a reality. So let's talk about the Suchet episode, as painful as it is for some people to talk about it, because in the same way that there are people like Catherine who refuse to read Curtain, there are also some people who cannot bear to watch this episode. And I get it. I actually love this tidbit from Mark Aldridge in Agatha Christie's Poirot, the Greatest Detective in the World. He writes, although the fact that the case features Poirot's death had never been kept as a surprise, contemporary reaction showed that many viewers were shocked to see his fate, most memorably shown in an episode of Channel 4's Gogglebox. The run-up to transmission meant that there was a spate of tie-in articles and programs, all designed to celebrate and commemorate the life and passing of Agatha Christie's great detective, this time as played out on screen rather than in the pages of a book. So this is episode 5, aka the last episode of season/series 13, aka the last season/series. It's the last of the last. It first aired in the UK on the 13th of November, 2013, just about 2 months shy of a full quarter century from the first airing of the first episode of this program, which was on the 8th of January, 1989. Quite a journey. The screenplay was written by Kevin Eliot, who also wrote Five Little Pigs and Death on the Nile, and it was directed by Hetty MacDonald, who also directed The Mystery of the Blue Train, which I didn't much like, to be honest, though Suchet specifically wanted her for this episode. He writes about this in Poirot and Me, saying, I was very keen that she should be with me for Poirot's final case because she was so sympathetic to his character. I believed her sensibilities and skill would be good for his last story, while it also meant that I could give 100% of my trust to her, which was enormously important for me. And David Suchet is not shy in his memoir Poirot and Me about the fact that Curtain was by far the best of the stories they had left to tell in this final season/series. Besides Curtain, there was Elephants Can Remember, The Big Four, Dead Man's Folly, and The Labors of Hercules. That was the release order, with Curtain coming last, of course. There was no doubt in my mind that the very best ones had been done already, Suchet writes. And although there were 4 gentle and engaging stories left, there was only one jewel in the crown of what remained. Curtain, Poirot's final case, which had never been filmed. But even though this was the last episode to be aired, it was actually the first to be filmed for this final season/series. Quoting again from Suchet in Poirot and Me, ITV decided that they would indeed make the final 5 films, and they wanted to make them in one sequence, ending with Curtain, but I knew that would be utterly beyond me and Poirot. If you read Dame Agatha's original novel of Poirot's demise, you will see that in it, he has lost a considerable amount of weight, not just from his body, but also from his face, and I wanted to show that to the audience. I needed time to lose a little weight from my face myself, and, even more important, to adjust to the idea that I was saying my final goodbye to him. That meant that I wanted to film Curtain first, and then leave a gap between that shoot and the filming of the final 4 more conventional stories so that I could recover the weight. That would also give me a chance to recover my emotional equilibrium after the pain of losing him. I was delighted when ITV agreed. They accepted that we could film Curtain in October and November 2012, and then go on to finish the other 4 stories after a break between January and June 2013. Suchet talks a lot about Curtain in Poirot and Me, which is not surprising. In fact, the book begins with him narrating what it was like playing Poirot in the death scene at the end of Curtain. For years, he writes, it has been Poirot and me, and to lose him is a pain almost beyond imagining. This is how he describes the state of the set on the day that they shot Poirot's death scene. The music swells, only to stop suddenly as the great bell rings to mark the end of the scene. Once again, silence falls across the set like a shroud. Sitting beside the sound man is the lovely Andrew Sissons, who has worked with us so many times before. Sheila is crying quietly, and he says to her in his soft, kindly voice, I didn't realize how emotional it would be. My driver, Sean O'Connor, is watching the scene on the video playback in tears, and so is Peter Hale, who has been my stand-in for the past 14 years, even though we do not look all that much alike. Sitting not far away, the makeup and continuity ladies are also wiping their eyes. For me, it is quite extraordinary to see everyone so emotional. I have never, ever experienced anything like it in my entire career. Andrew Sissons works in sound production, and Sheila is Sheila Ferris, David Suchet's wife. I just think that excerpt gives a lovely sense of how many people are involved in the production of a television program like Poirot, or any television program for that matter. It's easy to forget how many people are there, especially in an episode as quiet and lonely as this one. Suchet also writes a little later of this final scene. The challenge is to make the scene moving, but not too melodramatic. But at the same time, I want to convince every single member of the audience, wherever they may be around the world, that dying is not easy or comfortable. I do not want to sugarcoat the end of Poirot. I do not want to have to do this scene more than once, so I concentrate every fiber of my being on getting it exactly right. I am there to serve the Hercule Poirot that Dame Agatha Christie created, and nowhere can that be more important than in his last words. Poirot's labored breaths seem to take on a life of their own as he says, "Forgive me, forgive," and reaches across to pick up the rosary for the comfort it promises. Thankfully, it seems to work. Hetty calls cut, and the great bell rings to mark the end of this one and only take. I also found Suchet's thoughts on the scene where Hastings discovers Poirot's dead body to be extremely interesting and moving. Here's what he says. Once again, I am determined that it should not be sugary. I do not believe that he should be found lying there as though he were asleep. I want to show the television audience that he has suffered while not making it too gruesome. The bell rings and silence falls again. There is no dialogue, just the sight of Hastings throwing open the door to find Poirot's lifeless body tangled in his bedclothes. It has to be real. For me, that is what every actor should aim to bring to any part he plays. You remain true to your character no matter what happens. I do not want my Poirot to have a neat, sanitized death, filmed through soft gauze to give it a romantic haze. I want him to die as I hope I have helped him to live, as a real, extraordinary human being. I can tell how hard it is for Hugh to play the scene by the look on his face as he bursts into the room, with me lying there motionless, my left cheek against the pillow, my right arm stretched out across my body. For he too is losing someone very close to him, a friend through more than 120 hours of television films, a man he has spent almost half his adult life alongside. Hetty keeps the filming as brief as she possibly can, just getting Hugh's reaction in close-up as well as when he bursts into the room. Not a single person on that small set, including Hugh, Sheila, and I, want it to go on for one moment longer than it absolutely has to. It has been a brutal day, and we want it to end. It does. Hetty calls cut. The great bell rings, and we have finished. As you can tell from these passages, the episode is every bit as dark and dramatic as the book is. And I'm not going to play any clips from the episode because this is one of those instances where you really do have to see and not just hear what David Suchet and Hugh Fraser and everyone else is doing in the episode to appreciate it. So if you can bear it, I wholeheartedly recommend watching this excellent adaptation of Curtain. I have complained many a time on this podcast about how dour the later seasons of this show can be, but this is one instance where the show and Christie's oeuvre line up beautifully. These are both deeply depressing creations, and this show was well able to do what they needed to do to bring Agatha Christie's final Poirot novel to life. And they did it beautifully and faithfully, as they did so many times in the course of this program. And David Suchet is a little over the top, admittedly, about all of this and Poirot and me, but he is an actor, after all. No klaxon alarm bell required for that statement. And I will eternally appreciate how seriously he took the job of bringing Poirot to life, because it's the reason why that program is as beloved and special as it is. So this episode was well received and well reviewed, as it should have been. I will note that it was nominated in 2015 for an Emmy, the one and only time I believe it was nominated as an overall show for an Emmy. That was in the category of Outstanding Television Movie. It lost to Bessie. What is Bessie, you may ask? And I would answer, exactly. Curtain was robbed. I should also note, so as not to be all American-centric about this, that it was nominated for Best Drama Series or Serial in 1991 and 1992 by the British Academy Television Awards, though it did not win either time on its home turf. Just a few further notes. Poirot's letter to Hastings is clearly dated October 1949, and I appreciated this explicit setting of the episode. I think it's a really good approximation of the future time Christie seems to be going for in her text in a vague, fudgeable way. Given that this series mainly took place in 1936 or thereabouts, I think moving the action of this story 13 years into the future feels about right. And it's also nice that we're a couple of years removed from the Second World War as well, in that somewhat bleak post-war setting. I also appreciated that Suchet's Poirot at least pretends not to know who X is in the beginning, so it's not clear he's withholding this crucial information from Hastings, even though we do learn later on in the episode that he did withhold it. And this is in line with Suchet's somewhat softer take on Poirot, especially vis-a-vis Hastings, and I really like that. Their relationship on this show is so special and so tender in the way that isn't always borne out by the Poirot and Hastings of Christie's texts. We also get a newspaper headline of Poirot being dead in the Daily Telegraph, which felt like a nod to that New York Times obit. And I love that we get to see Poirot ripping off his fake mustache, which is absolutely faithful to Christie's text. But this also feels like such a great meta film moment. It's like Poirot is becoming Suchet for just one moment. And then we have the final shot of the episode, and we're able to see Poirot as he is writing this long letter or manuscript to Hastings. And David Suchet as Poirot looks up and looks directly into the camera. And I just want to contrast the pathos of this moment with that jaunty body pan of Poirot that we get in the very first episode of this program. Oh, how far we have come. And that is just a beautiful thing. Change is good. Change is natural. And I think it's so important that we do get this final shot of Poirot alive after having seen his dead body contorted in pain in that bed. And it's so important that we get to see him almost resurrected one final time here. And this is what David Suchet himself has to say about this final moment in Poirot and Me. It's really beautiful. I want to put across the twinkle in my eye that I've used so often when I have inhabited that little man. There has been enough gloom in this final story. It is important for me to finish with what might be mistaken for a smile. As I look across at the camera for the final time, I think back to Poirot's last words to Hastings. Cher ami, I said softly as he was leaving Poirot to rest. That phrase meant an enormous amount to me, which is why I repeated it after he had shut the door behind him. But my second cher ami in that scene was for someone other than Hastings. It was for my dear friend Poirot. I was saying goodbye to him as well, and I felt it with all my heart. That is just a beautiful passage, and You probably won't be surprised that that makes me think of Catherine and makes me emotional yet again. Don't worry, I'm not going to break down into tears. Close, but not quite. I also just want to note, I made reference at the top of this episode to the television film Murder by the Book, which focused on the would-be publication of Curtain by way of a battle of wits between Agatha Christie and Hercule Poirot himself. There's actually another much more recent television film that focuses on the would-be publication of Curtain in a very different way, involving a wartime murder mystery with a full cast of characters. That would be Agatha and the Midnight Murders. It first aired in the UK in 2020, and it has also aired in the US. It's the third in a series of alternative history Agatha Christie films in which Agatha Christie engages in a murder investigation parallel to real events that took place in her life. A different actor plays Agatha Christie in each of these films, which I really appreciate. They're quite playful and clever. And funnily enough, the actor who plays Agatha Christie in Agatha and the Midnight Murders is Helen Baxendale, who plays Elizabeth Cole in the David Suchet adaptation of Curtain. So that is a nice little connection there. I actually just covered in my September episode on the podcast Patreon account my own review of Agatha and the Midnight Murders to coincide with this very podcast episode. So that's my Patreon plug. Head on over to the podcast's Patreon account. I got a link in the notes to this episode, and check out my review of that film. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
All right, it is time to rank Curtain, Poirot's Last Case, the final novel to be ranked on this podcast. I am thrilled to have Linda Brobeck back with me now as co-host. Hi, Linda.
Hi, Camper.
As I usually do, I would like to start our discussion of the rankings by quoting from some reviews, contemporary and otherwise, of this novel. I'm actually going to start off with David Suchet, who writes in Poirot and Me. To be honest, it may not have been her finest Poirot story, but it was certainly her most deeply felt, and the whole world seemed to be affected. I actually think that perfectly sums up both the inherently flawed nature of this book, but its inherent power as well. Here is what the Times Literary Supplement had to say in a review by Francis Wyndham, who had the rare distinction of actually interviewing Christie. Not many people got to do that. I'm quoting now from Mark Aldridge in Agatha Christie's Poirot, the Greatest Detective in the World. He praised the author, writing that the book showed her skillfully anticipating nostalgia, but that more than this, no fair-minded reviewer could bring himself to say, except that the solution, when it is finally sprung, turns out to be as outrageously satisfying as The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, And Then There Were None, Murder on the Orient Express, and Crooked House. As she presumably intended, in this one, Agatha Christie has brought off the bluff to end them all. Then from The Guardian, alas, we do not have a review from Francis Isles, aka Anthony Barclay Cox. He was no longer reviewing for The Guardian because he passed away in 1971. Christie outlasted him. This contemporary review was by Matthew Cody, who wrote that Curtain was both a curiosity and a triumph. Through it, Dame Agatha, whose recent work has shown a decline, is seen once more at the peak of her ingenuity. Cody called Captain Hastings the densest of Dr. Watsons, but never has the stupidity of the faithful companion chronicler been so cunningly exploited as it is here. In providing the answers, the great illusionist of crime fiction provides a model demonstration of reader manipulation. The seemingly artless, simplistic Christie prose is mined with deceits. Inside the old, absurd conventions of the country house mystery, she reworks the least likely person trick with a freshness rivaling the originality she displayed nearly 50 years ago in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. For the egotistic Poirot, hero of some 40 books, pursuer of evildoers on Orient Express, Blue Train, and Nile, it is a dazzlingly theatrical finish. Goodbye, cher ami, runs his final message to the hapless Hastings. They were good days. For addicts everywhere, they were among the best. Wow, that is a gushing review, though I'm sure Dame Agatha was irritated by the mention of the mystery of the Blue Train, if she did in fact read that review. And then 2 months later, this same reviewer nominated Curtin as his book of the year, writing, "No crime story of 1975 has given me more undiluted pleasure. As a critic, I welcome it as a reminder that sheer ingenuity can still amaze. What Dame Agatha demonstrates against the odds is that there is life in the often despised puzzle story still." And I think we can all agree with that statement. Long live the puzzle mystery. Maurice Richardson wrote in The Observer upon publication that it was one of her most highly contrived jobs, artificial as a mechanical birdcage, but an unputdownable swan song. Love the mixing of bird metaphors there. And then you didn't think that Robert Barnard was going to be nice about this book, did you? Au contraire, here is how our critic we love to hate summed it up in A Talent to Deceive. Written in the 40s, designed for publication after Christie's death, but in fact issued just before it. Based on an idea toyed with in Peril at End House, Chapter 9, a clever and interesting one, but needing greater subtlety in the handling than Christie's style or characterization will allow. The characters here are in any case quite exceptionally pallid. In fact, for a long-cherished idea and as an exit for Poirot, this is oddly perfunctory in execution. And I don't think that Barnard is totally wrong, but I still think he's way harsh-tie. I'll come back to his point about the idea toyed with in Peril at End House later. A few more. Laura Thompson, Christie biographer, writes, "It has been said that there is an oddity about Curtin, deriving from the fact that it was written so many years before publication and has therefore no sense of real time, all references to period having been erased. This is true, though I will actually butt in for a moment and point out that John Curran posits there is actually no evidence for any supposed anachronistic references having been deleted from Christie's manuscript. It seems to have been created as a timeless story from the start, but in any case, back to Laura Thompson. For all that it was written when Agatha was in her glorious prime, Curtin is filled with the sense of the circumstances in which it was created, and the belief that it would only be seen when Agatha herself was dead. It has an air of displacement, of floating melancholy. I think that is very true. This book truly feels like no other Christie, which isn't to say that it's bad, just that it's sad and weird, which I think is very interesting. And then finally, of course, we have to get Christie scholar John Curran's take. Mr. Curran has a lot of thoughts about Curtin, so you'll be hearing from him quite a bit in the rankings portion of this episode. Here's his first hot take. In Curtin, Poirot's last case, Agatha Christie played her last and greatest trick of all on her readers, and they loved her all the more for it. This is the ultimate sleight of hand from the supreme prestidigitator in the crime writing pantheon. Who but Agatha Christie would have thought of and then carried out this almost sacrilegious trick? After 55 years of partnership, she unmasks Poirot as the killer. Certainly the book is contrived, which Detective Story is not, but only the most churlish of readers would complain after such a dazzling culmination of 2 careers. Well put, John Curran, and then here's one other little review from him that he provides. Curtin, Poirot's last case, is the most dazzling example of legerdemain in the entire Christie output. It is not only a nostalgic swan song, but also a virtuoso demonstration of plotting ingenuity, culminating in the ultimate shock ending from a writer whose career was built on her ability both to deceive and delight her readers. So I think it is safe to say that Mr. Curran quite likes Curtin. Linda, I would love to hear from you now. Where do you fall on this spectrum of response? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Or are you somewhere in between?
I actually have a mixed reaction to it. I don't know. I look at it that she was being fair and giving us clues as to who done it, but I think there's an ambiguity in it of whether or not, as you've read all these glowing reviews, that our dear detective actually is a murderer at the end. I guess I will speak to this on a series of characters, but I do think it is so out of character with everything that has been written prior to this about him and about how he's behaved in other cases. So I think the plot mechanics itself and how we get to the point where the final letter is written and we read what has been given to Hastings as to the conclusion of it, I guess I would kind of like take this apart a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One thing I'd say is that I think that even though it seems a little far-fetched that X could have manipulated so many people into committing crimes, I actually started thinking about this in terms of real-life cases that we have of people actually being convinced by someone to commit murder. And I thought about Jim Jones, first of all, in Jonestown, which happened in the 1970s, where a person convinced more than 900 people to take their own lives and mothers to kill their own children. And so I think that there is evidence that people are perfectly capable of manipulating others. You think about Charles Manson and how he was able to convince people to kill, and while he sat back and watched it happen. So I kind of believe that this is indeed possible. I guess what I would challenge listeners to think about is that if this is possible, if someone actually has the capability of influencing another to kill, wouldn't it be the ultimate thing? And here I go. I'll write this mystery for you, Kemper. I'll write a new mystery for you. What if instead of taking Hastings, who is clearly an unreliable narrator, what if we flip it and make Norton the unreliable narrator? And we retell this story of how he is this person who silently bird watches and watches people. And we all know from Miss Marple how clever you can be to sit back and watch and analyze people. What if he's tired of killing? What if he doesn't know how to stop? What if it's an addiction he can't stop? What if he wants to, in modern language, commit suicide by cop? What if he goes after the most famous of detectives and ultimately is killed by the most famous of them? Does that not make then Poirot not a killer, but actually a final victim of X? I think it's a really interesting idea because we are so convinced that this final letter is, that Poirot has convinced himself that he's done this. But what if he is actually manipulated into doing it? I think that we put so much trust in the narration of it that we don't bother to look to see if there's another solution. So I guess I am a little wavering on the plot mechanics themselves, because you have then Poirot not taking his medication or taking it out of his reach so that he dies. And that part of the story just throws me because, first of all, in many books, he's described as being a faithful Catholic. And by taking away someone's medication, you are either euthanizing them or you're committing suicide, one of those two options. And being the good Catholic that he describes in several novels, he's described himself as a Catholic by birth in the first Styles mystery. And then in Murder in Mesopotamia, mentions the religion several times. And then in Taken at the Flood, he states, I am a good Catholic. Well, the Catholic Church at the time the novel was written thought of suicide as a grave sin. And the Catholic Church denied burials of people that had committed suicide. I find it very hard to imagine someone who had lived his whole life by that belief to end his life himself under those circumstances. So I find the credibility of it a little bit lacking, frankly. So I would say in the plot mechanic part of it, I'd probably give it a 7 or so.
And how about plot credibility, since you
and credibility, I'd probably be somewhere between 5 and 6.
Okay, well, this is fascinating. First of all, we're not that far off in our scoring of these two categories, but we are completely flipped as to our issues when it comes to plot credibility in particular. And I think this is really fascinating. First off, though, I have to say your theory as to Hastings' unreliability as a narrator being taken that extra step is so smart. I never thought of that. I think you could absolutely read the book that way. One of the things I think Christie does do so well with Hastings in this book in particular, which one of those reviews mentioned, is that she uses him as a filter. And she did that in the early Poirots where Hastings would narrate. And that's why he was always slightly dumb so that, all of the clues would be misinterpreted by him. And she was employing irony in a very modern way, and actually in a way that Watson tended not to be employed by Arthur Conan Doyle. That's something the literary theorist Alison Light brought up when she was talking about how modern Christie was. Christie is constantly using Hastings as an unreliable narrator. So I think you have lots and lots of textual support, both from this book and the canon, to take that a step further and say, is Poirot being victimized here? And that's really, really interesting. So I love that. However, this is where I completely differ from you. And it honestly makes me respect Christie that much more, because I was utterly convinced by Poirot as murderer. And I was not as convinced by the concept of Norton being able to murder people by way of being a catalyst. It's really interesting that you bring up Jonestown and Charles Manson, because I didn't think of those as real world examples. I feel like if Miss Marple had been around when Jonestown happened, she would have loved to reference it in her matter-of-fact way lots of times and been like, well, of course the mothers murdered their children. What else did you expect? But for me, the believability of Poirot murdering Norton really does hinge on our buying the fact that Norton is actually responsible for all these deaths in the past. And this is how Poirot puts it in his letter at the end. Let's just quote from the text. In everyone there arises from time to time the wish to kill, though not the will to kill. We are all potential murderers, and the art of X was this, not to suggest the desire, but to break down the normal decent resistance. X knew the exact word, the exact phrase, the intonation even to suggest and to bring cumulative pressure on a weak spot. It could be done. And when I read that, my reaction was, really? And I think mainly because that takes time. And I think Jonestown, Manson, they didn't do that in 3 days. They didn't even do that in 3 months. That was years worth of grooming, for lack of a better word, right? People to partake of these horrible acts. And I think that it also requires a lot of luck. The one real world case that did occur to me was that notorious texting case from a few years back where a woman was convicted of involuntary manslaughter for her boyfriend's suicide. But in that case, she actively encouraged him to kill himself via a series of texts. She also did nothing to stop the suicide from playing out, which she was very much aware of every step of the way. So what Norton is doing, I think, is something different. And I just don't know if I believe that he could act as quickly and as effectively as he does on all these different people. And I do think that that's what Robert Barnard was talking about in his whiny review when he said that the concept, quote, needed greater subtlety in the handling than Christie's style or characterization will allow. I disagree with him that Christie wasn't up to the task as a writer. I think we can point to text after text after text, Five Little Pigs, Endless Night, The Hollow, et cetera, where she was up to that task. And she exhibited great subtlety in style and characterization. But I do agree with him that she didn't quite pull it off in this book. I believe that Mark Aldridge also agrees with me somewhat, though he's a bit more positive on this issue. He writes at one point, the ingenuity of the crime is breathtaking. And while the way in which the murderer operates may sometimes rely on good fortune, the basic premise of their actions is chilling and believable. But all of your points are well taken, Linda. And I wondered to myself, even as I was failing to believe in Norton's effectiveness, if I was just being naive. And again, I could imagine Miss Marple being like, oh, no, like that's quite possible. People are garbage and you can definitely make them kill their nearest and dearest quite easily within a matter of hours, if need be. I will say this on the score of Poirot as murderer. I find it extremely convincing and impressive, unlike you. So we disagree on this. I'm going to quote from John Curran yet again, because I think he does a great job of placing the high concept of Curtin in the context of the other Christie crown jewels. So this is what he has to say. In Curtin, Agatha Christie played her last great trick on her public. Throughout her career, she fooled readers into believing the innocent guilty and, more importantly, the guilty innocent. Her first novel made the most obvious parties the guilty ones. A few years later, she made the narrator the murderer. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, she rang the changes on the least likely character, the investigating policeman, the child, the likable hero, the supposed victim. She had everyone guilty and everyone victim. She repeated the Ackroyd trick in her last decade, but made it unrecognizable until the last chapter. By the time of Curtin, her only remaining least likely character was the one she chose, Poirot, her little Belgian hero. And in so doing, her title was also the only possible one, Curtin. And I think he's right about that. I mean, there was quite simply nothing left to do after this book was published, which, by the way, is why I officially concede defeat to Catherine in our ongoing debate about whether or not we should do Curtin or Sleeping Murder last. Unlike Sleeping Murder, which is an awkward final novel, this really is the novel that has the triumphant oomph of finality that we crave in our final Christie. So, Catherine, you were right. But I think that when it comes to Poirot as a murderer, the book acquits itself amazingly well in terms of plot credibility. And it is outlandish. And I take all of your points about the fact that Poirot is established to be a good Catholic. But I would argue, hasn't Christie been working herself up to this point for Poirot's entire career with all of his extra legal solutions? And I'm going to quote yet again, you guessed it, John Curran, who has the following to say about this, because he just encapsulates it so well. It should be remembered that Poirot was not above taking the law into his own hands and had done so to a greater or lesser degree throughout his career. In The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Peril at End House, Dumb Witness, Death on the Nile, Appointment with Death, and The Hollow, he facilitated at least the suicide of the culprit. And in Murder on the Orient Express and The Chocolate Box, he allowed the killers to evade legal justice. And then I myself would add to this list the short story Problem at Sea, which I never tire of bringing up, because that involves Poirot knowingly inducing a heart attack in the murderer, who dies as a result of Poirot's action. So, good Catholic or not, what Poirot does here is the next logical step for me. And I think it works, even though it's totally cuckoo. I mean, he has essentially become Dexter. And I think in a real way, and victimized, like you're saying, Norton. I mean, I love the idea that Norton perhaps is at the end and he realizes, I want to go out in a blaze of glory. And what better way than for my final victim to be none other than Hercule Poirot? But that also fits into what Christie is doing here. I mean, I don't actually think that takes away.
Would be genius.
Yeah, like I don't think that takes away from the plot mechanics. I actually think it kind of enhances them. And that's why we're actually not that far apart on plot mechanics and plot credibility. I was going to give credibility a 6, mainly for my issue with Norton as murderer, and then also Poirot's turn as the dread pirate Roberts when he's poisoning Norton. I find that a little hard to swallow, pun intended.
Right.
I do want to just note on that score that Christie considered making this sequence even more like the one in The Princess Bride, because rather than just having Norton swallow sleeping pills and be drugged and then dragged back to his room, at one point in her notebooks, she was going to have Poirot build up a tolerance for Tritium tablets for high blood pressure, which meant that when Poirot shared his chocolate with Norton, he would just die outright. Right there. So that's pretty extreme. I got that, of course, from John Curran, who reproduces so many of Christie's notes on Curtin in his second volume about her secret notebooks. Christie actually had a ton of notes for Curtin in particular in her notebooks. And John Curran talks about how that's probably proof of the fact that she really wanted to get it right and was just like refining and honing what she was doing here because she knew it was going to come at the end. But yeah, it's a little hard to believe. And Slumberil, a little bit of a dopey sleeping pill name. That pill actually gets a mention in After the Funeral, but it's another rare made up drug in a Christie story. I think it's a bit worse than Calmo, which we had in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, but definitely not as bad as Benvo, which was the drug in Passenger to Frankfurt. And then while we're on the subject of drugs and poisons and whatnot, In her excellent book, A is for Arsenic, The Poisons of Agatha Christie, Catherine Harkup points out that atropine was a well-known antidote to alkaloids like physostigmine. So it's a little convenient, actually, that Mrs. Franklin dies without getting any treatment. She probably could have been given an antidote and lived.
Also, I'd have a comment about that that Hastings accidentally switching the table so that she drinks the fatal dose, that to me was not credible. Yes, I realize that he's portrayed as a doofus. I mean, there's no question about that. But it seemed a little wanting in terms of the plot. I really didn't buy that as much as I did some of the other things. I just wanted to also look at the actual crime itself in terms of the killing of X. And that is that it's not just that he was killed. It's so thought out, so premeditated, up to having Perrault's valet not present. It's so premeditated. Yes, it's clever. Would you actually be convinced by someone, with a wig and the whole business, I don't actually think so, but perhaps I can pretend that I wouldn't be less observant than that. It just, for me, was not as convincing as many of her other books were. It just didn't convince me. And especially because we'll get to series characters, it just, to me, feels out of character.
I can understand that viewpoint. I think for me, when Poirot makes the decision to do this, when he goes that final extra step, and again, we've seen him take some of those baby steps in extra legality, and he decides to just go full throttle, whole hog, if you will. I believe that then he would just go all out. And I agree. I mean, the level of premeditation is shocking. I mean, I believe that Poirot would do that because I think he doesn't do things by halves. And I think what you have to do, though, is leap across the chasm of him actually making that decision. And that's fair that for you, it's a leap too far because it's a huge one that Christie makes. I was with her on that. But I do agree with you 100%, Linda. The revolving bookcase is totally something that happens in a mystery, but never happens in real life. I will say, though, that there is apparently or was a revolving bookcase on the first floor landing of Greenway. In the beginning of Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks, John Curran goes through going to Greenway for the first time and seeing all these different objects. And he points out how they relate to her books and, where Christie fictionalized them. And he mentions the revolving bookcase. But yes, in reality, is anyone actually going to turn around a bookcase and not realize that they've switched coffee cups? No, but for me, it harks back to Sparkling Cyanide and the sort of physical hijinks in a lot of those mid-career Christies where I just kind of shrug and agree to go along with the fun. That actually does bring me to my last points about plot mechanics. I don't want to let the gonzo high concept overshadow all of the other stuff that Christie's doing here. And you have already pointed out, I think, a lot of the other ways in which Christie's spinning a lot of plates, Linda. But I do love that we have overlapping triangles here as part of our solution, just as we did in Triangle at Rhodes. We think that the key love triangle is Dr. Franklin, Mrs. Franklin, and Judith, but actually it's Dr. Franklin, Mrs. Franklin, and Boyd Carrington. And just for an author who used love triangles over and over again to craft her puzzles, I think this is a fitting love triangle swan song, if you will. And then
I agree with that.
Yeah. Let's also not forget that in Norton's death, believable or not, we have an honest to goodness locked room mystery. I think this particular locked room mystery is somewhat easy to solve. And I do agree with you on that, Linda. It's not Christie's best. I am actually going to quote it yet again from John Curran as to Christie and locked room mysteries. He says, when it is a feature of a Christie plot, it is almost as an afterthought. It was never the main focus of her plot. I would say that the locked room element is much more central in Hercule Poirot's Christmas and Murder in Mesopotamia, but I definitely agree that it feels like an afterthought here. And then final note, I promise, on plot mechanics is just that I think it's worth highlighting another excellent point of John Curran's, which is that the 5 prior cases cited by Poirot in which X was involved are reminiscent of the setup in Mrs. McGinty's Dead. where four earlier and notorious murder cases affect the lives of the inhabitants of Broad Hinny. That's quoting Curran. And that to me is another recommendation for the plot mechanics of this book, because I quite liked Mrs. McGinty's Dead. And I like the fact that we have these 5 previous cases that provide a foundation for the intrigue to come in the story. So
Can I add one thing?
Yes, please.
One of the things that I found credible and actually quite an astute observation on Christie's part is that we have gone through countless novels and recognized in today's psychological language that our little Belgian detective has OCD.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's more noticeable, I think, in the adaptations with Suchet, who is arranging things on his desk and so forth, so that we visually can see that sense of OCD. The shooting of Norton, where he's shot through the center of the forehead, is the ultimate final clue as to the recommendation that probably he had OCD for sure, because he could not shoot through the temple. He had to shoot that single shot directly through the center of the forehead. You know, it had to be symmetrical somehow to him. And I think that that's a really observant, clever clue. I just thought that was sort of the capping off of the character and his mannerisms.
Absolutely. She gets a chef's kiss
Absolutely,
for sure.
On that one.
Yeah. It also harkens back to The Mysterious Affair at Styles, where one of the big clues is about Poirot straightening things on the mantelpiece.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it happened in the very first one. And she's been consistent about that characteristic. She's not consistent about everything with Poirot, but she's always consistent about that. It's a great and dark use of what has usually been used for laughs and mined for laughs over the course of the canon as a final moment. And I agree. I found it really powerful. You know, Monk, for example, is a direct descendant of Poirot. The characterization that she was doing here is something that I think a lot of authors after her have used. And we have lots and lots of quirky detectives. And she didn't invent quirky detectives, obviously. There's Sherlock Holmes, etc. But I think she went a long way to popularizing the quirky detective. And I think
it really contributes to his method, you know.
Method and order.
Yes.
Spoken like an OCD person. And, you know, by the way, it takes one to know one. I definitely have some, as perhaps listeners can tell from the length of these episodes and my rather thorough review of every Agatha Christie novel. You know, maybe I suffer from a little bit of that same affliction myself. Not the worst thing in the world. All right, let's rank then plot mechanics and plot credibility. I came out extremely high on plot mechanics at a 9, and I came out a little lower again, mainly for Norton, but a few other dings on plot credibility. I came out at a 6. How about you, Linda?
I would probably do plot mechanics if I give benefit of the doubt and kind of look past some of the little problems I have with it. I'd probably give it probably between a 7 and an 8. So let me give it an 8 to be close, so that we'd be close on that. And credibility, I'd go along with a 6 on credibility.
Okay, I'm happy with an 8 and a 6. That works for me. All right. Now let's move on into series-long characters. I suspect that I am going to be a lot more positive on this than you. I'm just going to say at the outset, I don't always go this high, but my instinct was to give this a 9, but mainly for Captain Hastings, actually. So we might actually be in agreement on Poirot in this book. I think that here's the deal. I think this is a superb Poirot and Hastings book because it so beautifully showcases the culmination of their relationship. I mentioned at the top of the episode that I think in a real way, this book centers on friendship, and that friendship between Poirot and Hastings really is a focus of the novel. It goes hand in hand with the puzzle mystery that Christie lays out. For that reason, you can say this is a superb Hastings book, since Hastings really exists only in relation to Poirot. He's the sidekick, but Poirot is, of course, more than his relation to Hastings. And I'm not sure that this is a superb Poirot book for a few reasons. But I think at the very least, it's a very good Poirot book. Before I turn to you, Linda, I just want to cover a few Poirot and Hastings moments, and this is going to be very celebratory. I love how as Hastings is about to see his friend again at the beginning, his heart beats, quote, slightly faster before he knocks on the door of Poirot's room. There's just so much love between these two, and it's really moving. And this is Hastings's first view of Poirot. It's quite poignant. It's a long quote, but I think it's worth it. Nothing is so sad, in my opinion, as the devastation wrought by age. My poor friend, I have described him many times. Now to convey to you the difference. Crippled with arthritis, he propelled himself about in a wheeled chair. His once plump frame had fallen in. He was a thin little man now. His face was lined and wrinkled. His mustache and hair, it is true, were still of a jet black color, but candidly, though I would not for the world have hurt his feelings by saying so to him, this was a mistake. There comes a moment when hair dye is only too painfully obvious. There had been a time when I had been surprised to learn that the blackness of Poirot's hair came out of a bottle. But now the theatricality was apparent and merely created the impression that he wore a wig and had adorned his upper lip to amuse the children. Only his eyes were the same as ever, shrewd and twinkling, and now, yes, undoubtedly, softened with emotion. Oh, be still my heart. I love these two old pals being reunited. And then when Poirot is complaining about his bodily deterioration, and more on this, by the way, in Stuck in Its Time, we are well aware of the ableism that is happening here in this text, and we will address it. Poirot does assure Hastings that his brain is still perfect. And Hastings writes, I could at least perceive clearly that no deterioration of the brain in the direction of modesty had taken place. And that is so consistent. Hastings was always bothered by Poirot's lack of modesty. We saw that in the very last episode I covered, the mystery of the Baghdad/Spanish chest. And then I also appreciated the way in the beginning that Hastings just flat out asks Poirot if he's hard up, since he doesn't understand why Poirot is living in this guest house at Styles, which he clearly hates so much because he's complaining about the food and the amenities and everything else. And he just asks him if he's hard up without prevarication. And I think it just shows how close these two are. Otherwise, the very English Hastings would never dare bring up such a personal subject. And Poirot answers very candidly back to him that no, he's doing fine. It's just a very understated moment that I think shows how close these two are. I'm almost done with these moments, Linda, but the exchange that I think is perhaps the best one involves Hastings and Poirot ribbing each other about the romantic proclivities that each of them has. And they're doing this in front of Judith. He likes them large and flamboyant and Russian for choice, says Hastings. So that is how you give me away, Hastings? Your father, Judith, has always had a penchant for auburn hair. It has landed him in trouble many a time. Judith smiled at us both indulgently. She said, what a funny couple you are. Very true, Judith. They are for sure a couple. I found it heartbreaking when Hastings tells Poirot at one point, you're good for many a long year yet. Poirot, it's like Hastings, he's basically the oldest man on the planet at this point, especially if we think this is taking place in 1975. He's almost done. And then, of course, at the very, very end, when Poirot dies, this is what Hastings writes in his narration. And it's beautifully understated, which is not the way Hastings's narration usually goes. He writes, I don't want to write about it at all. I want, you see, to think about it as little as possible. Hercule Poirot was dead, and with him died a good part of Arthur Hastings. Oh, my heart is just breaking then. So just so many lovely moments concerning the friendship between these two. And that's why I think Christie acquits herself so well in this category.
I completely agree with you on that. And I love those passages. The one thing I really did enjoy was learning a little bit more about Hastings, about his family, which I think was interesting. And seeing this modern daughter, Judith, who kind of is in contrast to everything that we know that he always prefers, you know. So, yeah, I love the characterization of both of them and their relationship. We will talk about Stuck in Its Time, but there's some really interesting ways in which Hastings is referred to as being stupid. And one of those is after Mrs. Luttrell's insults are overheard by the group of men sitting, Hastings states that no human being has the right to humiliate another human being, referring to Mrs. Luttrell's comments about her husband. And yet he doesn't see that he is always treated like that. He's like repeatedly referred to as stupid and doesn't find that humiliating. Apparently, it's only okay if women say that to men, not if another man says it to you. And
it's only not okay, right? That I was going to say that it's that there's a sexism inherent in Hastings' response. The only reason that they get up in arms is that it's Mrs. Luttrell who's putting down her husband.
And it's so perfectly okay that it happens to him repeatedly, and he doesn't seem to notice that.
I found that very convincing. I mean, and I think there are a lot of issues as to depictions stuck in their time. I think that most of the sexism that we see displayed in this book, though, is in the mouths of characters or in the voices of characters, and I think can be attributed to character choices that Christie's making, because I do believe that Poirot is sexist, and I do believe that Hastings is sexist. They're
of their time.
They're of their time. Exactly. Yes. And that's just who they are. And I think it would be disingenuous of her to pretend that they're anything else. And I think we still can love them, even though they're not perfect. And that's part of their being real. So I kind of embrace all of that, even though it can be distasteful or jarring. Right. I noted it for when we get to depictions stuck in their time, but I will just quote now from the text, because at the moment within that scene that really jars is the fact that Hastings says, "There was not one of us who did not feel deeply sorry for him and who would not willingly have murdered Mrs. Luttrell." That's what he says, because she, put him down, because a wife put a husband down. And earlier in the book, Poirot himself also says, "If it were me, I would take a hatchet to her." And it's so hateful and it's so misogynist. But I think Christie knew what she was writing.
Right. And one would like to believe that that has changed in the years since this was written, but I don't actually believe it has. So
if Catherine were here, she would say, no, it hasn't. I know that. I know she would say that.
Well, and I have a couple quotes about that I actually wrote down, that when Luttrell actually shoots his wife, Boyd Carrington says she gave him provocation. And that was, simply that here's a woman whose husband maybe wasn't what she thought he was at the beginning of their relationship either. And she's trying to financially keep them afloat. And of course, she's described later, Hastings thinks to himself that she was so charming then, but so apt to turn shrewish with the years. Yeah, such an unfair characteristic of her to be criticized for trying to financially keep them okay. If that had been a man who said that to a woman, for instance, that, you can't give your friends biscuits or cakes or whatever because that's coming out of our budget, we would all say, well, yes, that's because he's fiscally responsible, right? Yeah. Yeah. But, she's a shrew and you should kill her as a result. It's like, wow, that's some reaction.
No, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Christie's not endorsing those views in the book. But yeah, just focusing again on the series long characters, I was struck by the fact that Poirot's language is much more Frenchified here than it is in a lot of the late career Poirot books, when you could feel that Christie had gotten tired of all the mon amis and whatnot, the whole Poirot shtick. Here, for example, he refers to Dr. Franklin's bedside manner as the side of the bed manner. I think she dispensed with all of that by the time she got to the clocks and Elvins Can Remember and Third Girl. And that's just a curiosity born of the fact that the book was written 35 years before it was published. I did like that Poirot was still complaining about English cooking. Those Brussels sprouts, so enormous, so hard, that the English like so much. The potatoes boiled and either hard or falling to pieces. The vegetables that taste of water, and again water. The complete absence of the salt and pepper in any dish. I mean, she's doing all the work that she does to bring Poirot to life here in most of these books. I just wanted to bring this up because it's something that confused me a little bit, and I did a tiny bit of research into it. So I think this might be helpful for listeners who are reading the book. Poirot is said to be suffering from occasional heart attacks. That's how they're characterized in the book. I believe what he's really suffering from are bouts of angina related chest pain. That's the interpretation that's made in the Suchet adaptation, where they say explicitly that he has angina and that he's suffering from these attacks. I think it's a fair bet that the phrase heart attack, the way that was being used by Christie in and around 1940, is slightly different from how we would use it today. So I think that just helps clarify perhaps what's going on in terms of Poirot's illness. The medication that he takes for these attacks, by the way, they're ampoules of amyl nitrate. And that medication goes by another name, especially at least here in the States, and that would be poppers. So that's right, listeners. Poirot is taking poppers for the duration of this final case of his, till he denies himself those poppers at the very end. I just want to point that out. I thought that was very interesting. And then this makes me a bit sad, Linda, but I was struck by Poirot's statement to Hastings when he says, "The machine, mon ami, wears out." And my first response to that was, yes, that's really sad. But I then thought about Catherine, actually, because the machine only gets to wear out if you're lucky, actually.
Right.
And that's also at the heart of this. Poirot is old, no matter how old he is, if this is set in quasi 1949 fairyland or real 1975, he's lived a full life. And this is his swan song. And there is something celebratory about it, which I think she doesn't allow all that much room for, actually, in the book, because the book is so suffused with loss and mourning. And I think a lot of that actually really has to do with the fact that Hastings is mourning not just Poirot's senility and eventual death, but also the death of his wife. And that made me sad from the very beginning, because he describes right from the get-go that he's a very lonely and unhappy man in his wife's death. It did make me happy that they had 4 children together. I agree with you on that. He says one boy was in the Navy, the other married and running the ranch in the Argentine. My daughter Grace was married to a soldier and was at present in India. My remaining child Judith was the one whom secretly I had always loved best, although I had never for one moment understood her. Her brains were the best of the family. And I thought to myself, that sounds a little like Hastings' relationship with Poirot, doesn't it? He never really quite understands what Poirot is saying. And a little later, he even says, I was, frankly, a little nervous of my daughter. And it seems that Hastings thrives in these relationships with someone who's intellectually superior to him. And I thought that was really sweet and believable that he loves Judith best, even though she is a tough person and they don't always connect. Although, Judith's brains being the best of the family might not be saying much. Just going to put that out there.
Oh, Camper.
I couldn't resist taking a dig myself. Poor Hastings. He's a punching bag till the very end. But yeah, this is just a death-infused book. I mean, let's just take this passage about Hastings' wife. A fresh sense of despair and loss swept over me. If only my dear wife were alive, she on whose judgment I had relied for so many years. Without her, I felt miserably inadequate. I was not, heaven help me, a clever man. It's like, oh, sweet, stupid Hastings. So much death, so much loss, so much pain. And then a little later, Boyd Carrington tells Hastings how lonely he is. And then Hastings narrates, I was silent. My sympathy was too acute to be put into words. For I, too, was a lonely man. Since Cinders had died, I felt myself to be only half a human being. And then this, I think, might be the saddest passage of all. I just had to pull it out. A deep and spreading sadness permeated me. How true it was. Here we were, a collection of twilit people, gray heads, gray hearts, gray dreams. Myself, sad and lonely. The woman beside me, also a bitter and disillusioned creature. Dr. Franklin, eager, ambitious, curbed and thwarted. His wife a prey to ill health. Quiet little Norton limping about looking at birds. Even Poirot, the once brilliant Poirot, now a broken, crippled old man. How different it had been in the old days, the days when I had first come to Styles. The thought was too much for me. A stifled exclamation of pain and regret came to my lips. She might be laying it on a bit thick, actually, in that passage. And again, I just want to qualify that the ableism of that passage is not lost on me and will be addressed later. But, the final thing I want to say on Hastings is that for all my carping about the believability of Norton as a catalyst for these murders, I have to say that the sequence in which Hastings almost kills Allerton is actually pretty believable and pretty well
absolutely
done, right?
Absolutely, it is.
It goes a long way to selling this book. And it is actually what I remember the most from my first read of Curtain, which was probably 30 years ago. And what I also love about it is that it's an extended and extremely dreary and just upsetting sequence in which we see Hastings truly come close to murder. And then he opens up the next chapter, which starts on the following morning with this. There is something about writing down an anticlimax in cold blood that is somewhat shattering to one's self-esteem. For the truth of the matter is, you see, that I sat there waiting for Allerton and that I fell asleep. And it's funny, and it's one of the truly funny moments in the book. And I love that that moment belongs to Hastings.
And also that idea that tomorrow is another day.
Yes. And when you get a fresh perspective, and he's like, oh my God, of course, the clouds have cleared. And it's Poirot who gives him that, right? By drugging him.
Could I also just interject here that I think that all of the descriptions of his grief and his description of the grayness is accurate, but also that he wakes up the next day fresh again, in that because he's had these experiences, he does not fail to see the beauty of the next day. I think that that's also something of his character, too, in that he's not stuck necessarily in that place of grayness. He's up and describing his daughter as beautiful and so forth, so he's still seeing the beauty of the world despite his sadness. I think that was clearly written in that respect, that you could see that he still had the potential of happiness. And I think that's lovely. And at the very end, when he's obviously encouraged to go seek out another woman in his life, I think that's also a kind of a tender, loving thing to do. But I do think I agree with you entirely about the scene where he is almost pushed to murder. It does speak to the fact of how easily someone could be manipulated, especially in regard to someone you love dearly. When my children are young, I remember the conversation of someone saying to me, "Oh, I could never kill anybody." And me replying, "Oh my gosh, if someone was going to hurt my children, and if it was me or my children being hurt, I mean, there's like absolutely no question that would be the outcome, As a mother, you would do anything. You would, stand in front of a train for your children, And I think what you said about Hercule's body failing, and he's at the end of his life and the machine is wearing out, so to speak. And you mentioned Catherine of being so young, and her machine wore out without her knowing it, with something happening to her that she wasn't even aware was happening. I am Northern European, and I carry the genetic disease that she had. And as a mother, it breaks my heart.
It breaks my heart too, Linda, though it goes without saying, there's no fault here on anyone's part. Catherine's affliction and her death were a shock and a tragedy. And just for the sake of clarity, the name of the genetic disorder she had is alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, more commonly known as alpha-1, which may result in lung disease or liver disease.
We know that she was in final stage liver cirrhosis, that her liver was completely impaired. And, not knowing that I had passed on this to her, like many things, we want to believe we have control. And that's kind of a contrived concept, right? We want to believe that we have control over things, but there are so many that we don't have control over. I mean, Catherine had symptoms of this from childhood, but they were written off as something else. And it took her dying to be able to figure out what it was. And that's so sad. And also, there's a whole discussion that could be done around women's health also. To have her die from something that was lurking in her body all this time without knowing, it's just heartbreaking, I know there's a lot of people out there whose children die and who, have sickle cell anemia or, cystic fibrosis or childhood cancer or whatever it happens to be. And you just don't anticipate it. And I think that it would probably drive you insane if you did. You just have to learn to deal with what comes to you,
And to relate that back to Curtin and to Hastings and Poirot, because you had originally made the point that, there's something beautiful about the way that Hastings can move on in some form. I mean, it's interesting how, even though there's that Papa Poirot moment where he's trying to pair off Hastings and Elizabeth Holmes, it's not very obvious that they're necessarily going to pair off. She has certainly tied many a novel off in a neater bow than that, where it's very clear that they will end up together. And I think this is too grief-stricken and melancholy of a novel in which to end like that. But even so, there's that soupçon of hope. And I think it is only because Hastings has that beautiful nature that Poirot talks about. And he's a bit belittling when he says that he has such a beautiful and open nature. But it's true. And I think in that passage that I read where he's talking about gray heads, gray hearts, gray dreams, it's almost as though Christie is begging us to add gray cells, like the little gray cells, because that's the way in which, Hastings is different from Poirot. He does not have the perspicacity that Poirot has. And in a way, that's part of his strength, right? Because Poirot, as we see here, taking things to the nth degree, has become an extremely premeditated murderer, whereas Hastings is living to see another day and moving beyond the second mysterious affair at Styles. And
there's a purity in it.
A purity. And Christie really is selling all of this, and I think building on what she's done with these characters leading up to Curtin and then in this very book.
I think the series characters are actually wonderfully written in this. I would probably give it an 8 or 9.
I would definitely give it a 9. I just want to know a few more quick notes on series long issues before we get into book specific characters. We do get a blink and you miss it cameo from George / George, who Hastings describes as having absolutely no imagination. And I'm just really tired of that description for Poirot's professional helpmeets. I'm still smarting from the abuse of Miss Lemon and the mystery of the Spanish chest. So I guess I'm a little sensitive on that. But I also very much appreciated how many references there were in this book to the mysterious affair at Styles. Those are obviously crucial references. You could tell Christie had reread it just prior to writing Curtin, and or that she was consulting it while she was writing. We get references to almost every character in the book, I think. Evelyn Howard, John and Mary and Lawrence Cavendish, Cynthia Murdoch, Emily and Alfred Inglethorpe. She even quotes the final lines of the book almost verbatim. And then both stories take place in the heat of summer. And this might be a stretch, but there are a lot of references to that dispatch case of Poirot's where he files away the clues that he leaves for Hastings. And a dispatch case belonging to Emily Inglethorpe featured quite prominently in Styles. So I thought that was another echo. Mrs. Franklin's death mirrors that of Mrs. Inglethorpe's. Both of them are poisoned and then taken violently ill in the middle of the night, dying extremely violent deaths. And I really loved this, but Poirot gets out of his wheelchair when he is doing his impersonation of Norton, and he walks and he limps when he does so. He's not putting on the limp. It's very much real. And to me, that mirrors the Poirot of the mysterious affair at Styles, because when we first meet Poirot, he does have a limp. And it's a seemingly war-related injury that he very conveniently gets over very quickly. I think because Christie was like, I can't deal with this. But I like that the limp was back for his final outing. It's a nice circular moment for Poirot. And then beyond Styles, we get a ton of other references to earlier Poirot cases. He says, twice in my life, I have warned a murderer, once in Egypt, once elsewhere. In each case, the criminal was determined to kill. It may be so here. Without being more specific about it, he is referring definitely to Death on the Nile. That's the Egypt case. And then the novella Triangle at Rhodes. And then there's a lot of talk of the ABC murders where the motive was hidden, just as it is in this book. And a curious reference to Sad Cyprus. Hastings says, there is, you are quite sure, no far-fetched financial motive. Nothing, for instance, like you found in the case of Evelyn Carlyle. First of all, that's a little bit of a spoilery reference, but it's Eleanor Carlyle, who features in Sad Cypress. So maybe Christie just mixed up her name because she had just referenced Evelyn Howard in The Mysterious Affair of Styles. That's another instance where I'm like, couldn't her editors have just paid a little more attention? I also just want to note that the two central concepts in this novel of Poirot being a murderer and Norton being a catalyst to murder are actually mentioned in other Christie novels. We have references to the Poirot as murderer motif in the novella Murder in the Mews and also in the novel The ABC Murders. So that's extra continuity points for the ABC Murders. It mentions Curtin and then also gets mentioned in Curtin. And then finally, as Robert Barnard pointed out in his review, there is that reference made in Peril to Endhouse to the notion of a murderer who works by way of inspiring others to commit murder. And this is the quote from Peril to Endhouse. Catherine Brobeck favorite. I want to quote that book just for her in this episode. Such a jealousy as drove the Iago of your great Shakespeare to one of the cleverest crimes, speaking from the professional point of view, that has ever been committed. Why was it so clever? I asked, momentarily diverted. That's Hastings speaking, of course. Parbleu, because he got others to execute it. Imagine a criminal nowadays on whom one was unable to put the handcuffs because he had never done anything himself. And of course, Othello features very prominently in this book as well. So 9 then for book-specific characters. Let's move on into what I think
Can I add one more thing?
Oh, sure.
Go back just a second. And that is that you mentioned that she'd moved on from all those little idiosyncrasies that he had initially. But I don't think that she would deliberately rewrite that, because as we age, and many people that I know who reach a good old age of, late 80s, 90s, and so forth, they often go back to earlier times in their life. My own grandmother was 97 years old, and she would occasionally lapse into some expression that was in another language, So it may have been deliberate that she actually left those things in rather than revise them later when on a second reading of it, later before it was going to be published or whatever. Because I think that we tend to do that. We tend to kind of revert back, as we age to a happier time.
I like the idea of Poirot returning to his roots in his old age. I think that can happen. Excellent marks on series-long characters. Unfortunately, I don't think the same can be said for book-specific characters. I do think this is the weakest category when it comes to Curtin, Poirot's last case. I would go so far as to say that for the high quality of the book in all other areas, I think the book-specific characters are shockingly weak. Norton is a weak character. And to be clear, I don't mean that his character is weak, which it kind of is, but that he isn't a particularly well-drawn character, which is extra problematic since he's the murderer. And that's a problem that Christie and many mystery writers run into time and time again, because of course, we can't know too much about the real Norton or else the mystery would be spoiled. So it kind of comes with the territory. And yet, I think in the best Christies, she gets around this problem. And how? I will just bring up Five Little Pigs as just such a perfect example of that. We know that murderer backwards and forwards by the end of that book. This is not one of the best Christies, I think, when it comes to the character of the murderer. What's good are all the times that Poirot is talking about him. I loved this description where he says that people liked him without, at the same time, noticing him very much. And I think you mentioned this earlier, Linda, but you could say much the same about Miss Marple and even Poirot himself. And that's kind of Norton's power. And at another point, Poirot says that Norton drew on the best in people to bring out the worst, which also speaks to what you were talking about earlier, Linda, in terms of drawing on Hastings's love for his daughter to bring him about to murder Allerton. And it really is true. I mean, I think that people are naive when they think that their better emotions can't be drawn on to do horrible things. So she's convincing about what Norton does, but I didn't find him to be particularly memorable. And I have a little conspiracy theory about this, because one thing I noticed in her many notes for this book, as I was pouring through John Curran's book on Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks, is that Christie often included the character of Norton's mother along with Norton himself. And to be clear, for once, this is not something I'm getting from John Curran. I'm gleaning it from his book, but he did not make this point. So this is actually an independent thought that I had. I know, right? I'm breaking out on my own here, John Curran. So This mother character was an overbearing woman who barely gets mentioned in the finished product. There's kind of a throwaway misogynistic line about her being bossy.
There is, yes.
And in earlier versions of the story, she actually kills herself when she finds out how monstrous her son is. And then Norton gets framed for her suicide and thereby caught. In one version, it's the mother who frames him. And in another version, it's Poirot. These are all versions she toyed around with in her notebooks. I'm glad she didn't do that. I'm glad that Christie excised this character because there are plenty of characters as it is. And I think, again, Poirot's personal execution of Norton packs quite a punch. But I wonder if Norton isn't a little bit lacking because he was conceived in concert with his mother. And then the mother was removed from the story, and almost all references to her were removed from the story. He's a little bit like a twin whose double has died, if that rather twisted analogy makes sense. So I think already when you have a murderer who's not necessarily jumping off the page, that's a problem.
So did you have this reaction that I had to the scene when he's looking through the binoculars and he puts them down, feigning that he saw something, and Hastings wants to see what he saw? You have young children, so you've probably seen the Disney movie Up.
Sure.
Where the dog, Doug, is like, squirrel!
Yes.
Doesn't matter that you're in the middle of a different conversation or whatever. It's squirrel.
Right.
And it just reminded me so much of that. Of course, that made me laugh to myself, as ridiculous as that is. But that is what that scene in the book reminds me of. It's like,
clunky.
Yes, it's such a misdirect. And it's like really obvious misdirect, that bird watching thing. I don't know about you, but didn't you automatically suspect him, just because here's this person that's a bird watcher who's like silent, and everyone else has got like a character built around them, and you're hearing their dialogue and so forth. But then there's this one person who's sitting back and, you're not hearing anything about them other than these very brief references to him. For me, that was, oh yeah, well, he did it.
It's funny. I didn't, and I'm always very bad at guessing the solution to these murder mysteries, unlike Catherine, who was always determined, right? I know you know.
Oh, she was.
To figure out the ending.
Speaking of which, I will tell you, and Catherine's sister will laugh about this when she listens to this. She would read a book and I would be reading the same book, only she would read at twice the speed as I would. And she'd have to call me to talk about the book, right? And I would be in the middle of the book, but she would have to keep talking about it until, of course, she revealed every detail about it. And I would be so mad and say, Catherine, don't do that. Don't ruin it for me, And she did it with every movie and television show. And we would say, don't tell us the ending. But she loved it. And she was especially dismissive of some of the recent books with the unreliable narrators in them. And she would be, I knew who did it, after 5 pages or something,
There's a no more instinctual spoiler ever created than Catherine Brobeck. I mean, spoiling was in her very blood. She loved to spoil. And I remember the most extreme version of that sort of thing that she told me is that she was also a cruciverbalist, right? She was a crossword enthusiast and really good and really fast at crosswords.
Yes.
And she said that she used to essentially spoil crosswords for her dad, right? And the two of you would do them together, right? And you do them at a regular pace, and then she'd pass by and essentially fill it all in 2 seconds. And you two would be like, that was our Sunday morning. You ruined it.
Together. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and then she got to the point where, she did the New York Times crossword puzzles, and she would do them, even the hard version as they got on in the week, in literally 25 minutes or 20 minutes or something, which was just infuriating to us as we were struggling, getting halfway through it, you know, and there's two of us doing it, and yeah, she was very funny about that. But yes, I mean, so the fact that I thought it was Norton at the beginning of this clearly made me also think about Catherine and her need to always tell you who did it, even if you wanted to read it for yourself.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, and again, Catherine hadn't read Curtain, right? Because she never wanted to, and she was going to for this episode, but there's no question that she would have guessed it was Norton and been very pleased with herself. I did not guess that it was Norton. I actually did remember enough on my reread from my first read that halfway through I was like, I think it's Norton. But it's one of those times often when you find out who the murderer is in a Christie novel, you're like, oh my God, it's that person for whatever reason. Because you're like, that is insane. This is one of those times where I was like, okay. It's a little bit like, okay, it's him. I didn't realize it was him, but it's him. Okay. And that's the biggest.
Who did you want it to be?
Well, this is the problem with this category. Honestly, Judith, maybe, but that would have been so upsetting if Hastings' favorite daughter, his favorite child, was the murderer. But that would have been revelatory, and I would never have seen that coming, and it would have been shocking, though upsetting. Everyone else, these characters are a little flat, a little interchangeable. And that's why the reveal of the murderer, even though what he does is a new spin on what she was doing, it's why I found it to be a little deflating. I mean, I thought that Boyd Carrington, Elizabeth Cole, Major Allerton, the Luttrells, and Dr. Franklin were all either unconvincing or boring or both.
Right.
And I think Christie has certainly done worse, way worse, but she's also done much better. I do have a few positive points, though. I really like the point Laura Thompson makes about Mrs. Franklin. She serves to showcase Christie's knowledge that women need not appear strong in order to be strong. Laura Thompson writes, the fragile little Mrs. Franklin in Curtain is despised for her wiles by the grave young scientist Judith. She's a very stupid woman, says Judith, but Poirot wisely replies, she uses her gray cells in ways that you, my child, know nothing about. Mrs. Franklin went down in my estimation when she was described as the Madonna type, however, which is totally a crutch of Christie's. It's one that she used a lot more in earlier books than the later ones. So that took me back, but not in a good way. But then on the plus side, I just have to mention that the relationship between Dr. and Mrs. Franklin reminded me a lot of the one between Lydgate, Dr. Lydgate, and his wife Rosamond in Middlemarch. The way that she hinders him, and he realizes too late that he made a poor choice, and he really is her intellectual superior. And a comparison to George Eliot is never a bad thing. So I did like that. And then this is a really small point, but the relationship between Boyd Carrington and Mrs. Franklin from years earlier, when he, quote, played with her as a tiny tot when he was a young man, that reminded me of Christie's relationship as a girl with her brother-in-law, James Watts, who was the husband to her sister Madge, who was a lot older than she was. And James Watts used to play with Agatha in the Garden of Ashfield, and she would go over to Abney Hall for the holidays and for other events and whatnot. And they were really fond of each other and seemed to have had a really lovely relationship. And I just have to think that she was thinking about that when she created these characters. And then also Boyd Carrington says that when he reconnected with Mrs. Franklin later, when she was a young woman, just on the point of making her debut in the world, that he, quote, did my share by taking you out on the golf links and teaching you to play golf. And that is precisely what family friend and fiance Reggie Lucy did for Christie. He taught her how to play golf, and he was very kind to her. And that's the man that Christie kind of sort of jilted, breaking off her strange and secret, but nevertheless real engagement to him to become Mrs. Archie Christie. And I think she had some regrets, or at least second thoughts about that later on in life. I like that she was drawing on her own life. And one other point that reminded me of Christie's own life is that when Colonel Luttrell remembers what it was like meeting his wife Daisy for the first time, I thought it was very reminiscent of Archie and Agatha's meeting. Luttrell says, I remember so well. Yes, it was at a hunt ball. She wore white stuff called tulle, I think it was, floated all round her. Such a pretty girl. Bowled me over then and there. I said to myself, that's the girl I'm going to marry. And by Jove, I brought it off. Awfully pretty way she had with her. Saucy, plenty of back chat. Always gave as good as she got, bless her. And that's such a nice antidote to all the misogynistic commentary about Mrs. Luttrell. Right. But it sounds very much like Agatha and Archie, who did meet at a neighborhood dance in the country, not unlike, I imagine, a hunt ball. And she dressed in tulle-based party dresses. You can actually see one of them in a photo insert in her autobiography. She's quite lovely in it, actually. And then the other thing I have to say, even though Hastings obviously belongs squarely squarely in the series-long character category, there is some fun involved in being able to see everyone through Hastings's eyes, because he is our first-person narrator here. And I really appreciated his first sight of Boyd Carrington, because Hastings is completely taken in by him, though we as readers aren't so easily won over. And certainly by the end of the story, it's pretty clear that Boyd Carrington is an ass with a capital A. Right. But here's Hastings' first impression of him. I felt very attracted at once towards the man. He was very good looking, though a man well over 50 with a deeply tanned face. He looked as though he had led an out-of-doors life, and he looked, too, the type of man that is becoming more and more rare, an Englishman of the old school, straightforward, fond of out-of-doors life, and the kind of man who can command. In other words, I think that's the kind of man Captain Hastings fancies himself to be. Yeah. And I'll also just note that Major Allerton is likewise described as having a bronzed face. Oh, Agatha, if you're a good-looking man in an Agatha Christie novel, you have a tanned face because, of course, you are also a white man. And then I guess saving the best for last, Judith really is, I think, the best of the book-specific characters, though that's not saying much. I can't help feeling that there's something lacking with her as well. And I remember feeling that way on my initial read. I think it's because we're supposed to believe Poirot when he says she's made of very fine stuff, which I referenced earlier in the episode. She seems like she might be engaging in an affair with Allerton, or that she might have murdered her boss's wife for gain. But in the end, this austere and intimidating daughter of Hastings is supposed to have a heart, or at least a moral compass of gold. And yet all the euthanasia and eugenic stuff, which we will talk about when we get to depictions stuck in their time, muddies that to the point where I don't think she quite succeeds as a character in the way Christie intends her to. I did have to remind myself that this very strong-willed and rather feminist 21-year-old was not a creation of the 1970s, but had been created in 1940 or thereabouts, because she really does seem very modern in her outlook. She is more successful, certainly, than any of the other characters, and I think the most memorable.
So I wanted so much to like her, and so wanted her to be that finally here's a woman who is college educated and who wants to actually do something with her intellect other than be, someone's spouse. But then the final ending of it is that, she marries the doctor and it's all okay, that she's going away not as his assistant, but as his wife. And as though that's the final trophy, is to be someone's wife, and that was disappointing to me.
It's very like Anne Bedingfeld in The Man in the Brown Suit, off with her love in the wilds of Africa and living blissfully happy. And it feels like there's just a little bit of a disconnect with Judith, and she never completely clicks. I
think part of it also is the lack of affection she shows to her father. And that's kind of hard for me as well. But I did learn something from Agatha, which I did not know before, by way of my not understanding a description that she had. Hastings, in his description of Norton, he was running his hands through his hair, and his hair stood on end. And he mentions that he looks like Strumo Peter. Did you get that?
I did. She has actually used that reference before, and so I had to look it up at an earlier time.
I didn't know what that was, and it was a German's children book written in 1845. But as an artist, I thought it was most interesting that it was kind of a precursor to comic books, and one of the first to use chromolithography, which is multicolored prints.
Interesting.
And I thought that was super interesting that she would mention that. And then even more interesting was that many years later, 1891. So if that was written in 1845, so 1891, Mark Twain wrote a translation of it called Slovenly Pete. And it was published in 1935. It's some 25 years after he died, I thought, well, that's super interesting, in some weird tangent way, which is not unlike me.
No, she uses that because he is a children's figure that has hair made out of straw, right? So his hair stands up on end.
Straight out, yeah.
She uses that to describe someone's hair standing up when they muss it. It's like one of her ticks. She has certain descriptive ticks that she uses, and
it was just one of those things. I'm reading along, and I thought, now what is that?
Well, where did you come out on book-specific characters, Linda?
You know what? I was trying to be nice by giving it a 5. That was me stretching it a bit, I would say. Yes.
We can, in the spirit of always being generous to Dame Agatha, especially on this, her final book, I will go with your 5. I was going to give it a 4, but I'll go along with your 5, actually. I think that's fair. An extremely kind 5.
Okay.
We can get to that. All right, let's move on to setting and tone. Let's deal with setting first. I actually think that we have to break up setting into 2 subcategories as to location and time. So taking location first, here is, you guessed it, John Curran on the setting of Styles in this book. The return to Styles was inspired. It encompasses the idea of a life come full circle as Poirot revisits the scene both of his momentous reacquaintance with Hastings and of his first great success in this adopted homeland. Like Poirot himself, Styles has deteriorated from its glory days, and instead of having a family gathered under its roof, is now host to a group of strangers. And Curran also makes the excellent point that, quote, the claustrophobic atmosphere of the novel is accentuated by having only 2 short scenes, those depicting Mrs. Franklin's inquest and funeral and the visit to Boyd Carrington's house, set elsewhere. And that's such a good point, and I didn't realize it until I read that in Curran, but the book really does almost solely take place at Styles, and it is very claustrophobic, and that's obviously intentional on Christie's part. My big point I want to make as to setting is that we cannot forget that A House Called Styles had to be very different for Agatha Christie from the perspective of whenever she was writing Curtain, no matter the date, 1936, 1940, 1942, it was somewhere in and around there. Whenever it was, at that point, she was on the other side of all the horrors that had gone down at the real life Styles. And that is the home that she made with Archie Christie in Sunningdale in the 1920s. Laura Thompson actually writes quite eloquently about this. She says, the memory of driving away from Styles on a December night was still near to the front of her mind, as perhaps it always was. And that, of course, is a reference to the breakdown of Christie's marriage, culminating in her infamous disappearance from Styles for 11 days in 1926. So it's still hard for me to believe that the Christies actually chose to name their first, and as it turned out, only full-on freestanding house that they lived in together Styles in honor of Agatha's first public mystery. Why did they think that was a good idea? It's like they were cursing themselves. But it's interesting then to keep that in mind when reviewing the various comments that Christie makes about Styles over the course of the book. I think it puts them in their proper perspective, and I just want to pull out a few. At one point, Hastings is reviewing the cast of characters from the first Styles case, and he concludes, no, none of them had been happy. And now, again, no one here was happy. Styles was not a lucky house. Indeed, Agatha. And then later, Hastings even theorizes that there's a sort of infection in the air of Styles due to the murder that took place there long ago. And Poirot responds, a virus of murder, you mean? Well, it is an interesting suggestion. Hastings responds, houses do have an atmosphere. This house has a bad history. At one point, Hastings muses, did the fact that death by violence, by malice aforethought, had taken place in a certain spot leave its impression on that spot so strongly that it was perceptible after many years? And this, Linda, made me think of that story that Catherine told about Glen Sheen, the haunted mansion she visited with you and the rest of her family. Listeners, it is worth a listen on our Patreon episode having to do with the ghost stories of Edith Wharton, Rebecca Du Maurier, and of course, Agatha Christie. But I have to imagine you thought of that as well.
I absolutely did think of it, that houses have an atmosphere. I happen to have lived all over the United States and such. We would go house hunting in various places, and I would walk into a house and you could just feel the atmosphere of it, and that sometimes determined whether I was going to continue the house hunt or not. It would be like, nope, I'm not looking even, my mother. Once we owned a house in Chicago, and I walked in and it was just lovely. It was just, the house itself needed lots of work, but there was something about it. There was something peaceful about it. In fact, it was Catherine's first home. And I was later to find out that the owner died in the garden. And it was a lady who had lived there her entire life, and she loved gardening. The back was just this beautiful backyard of perennials. And she died in her garden. And to me, that was just like, well, she died doing something she loved. And the house felt like that. It had felt like there was lots of love there. And there was. And it continued to be like that, But Catherine and I had that experience of being on a tour and having the same feeling at the same time of this sort of coldness. And I mean, we've all had that feeling before where the hair stands up on your arms, that kind of feeling, that, oof. And actually needing to leave because it felt so oppressive. And yes, I actually completely felt that in the tone of the book. You could feel that something was not right and that it had deteriorated to a point that perhaps the architecture now matched the atmosphere. I think it was well done, actually. I actually scored very high on the setting and tone because I felt it.
I did too. And I think it's not what Christie's often doing when it comes to painting a setting. She's often, P.D. James gave her credit for the fact that she could situate a story and describe a setting quite economically. It was just a couple of words and you felt like you were there. She never over describes the way Daphne du Maurier sometimes does, and other people, perhaps even P.D. James herself. And I love that. But here she's doing something a lot harder, right? And it's sinister and it's very tricky. So I think, yes, high points for Styles itself. We don't get much of the surrounding village of Styles St. Mary. There is a little bit of attention paid to the fact that time has passed and there's petrol stations and a cinema and 2 more inns and rows of council houses, but that's really perfunctory at best. I would now like to consider when the book takes place, because that's, I think, setting as to time. That's a very vexed question. And I talked about this in the first part of the episode. Are we actually in 1975? Are we in some quasi decade or two in the future from the perspective of 1940 or so? Interestingly, the fuzziness of time really bothered me in the late career Christies that I've covered recently, like in Elephants Can Remember and Postern of Fate, because I think you could tell that Christie didn't intend for the timing of events to be fuzzy in those books. You could tell that that was Christie not functioning at the height of her powers. But here, because again, she's doing something kind of sinister and kind of tricky, the fuzziness feels intentional. And I was just able to sit back and enjoy it. I think you can decide that this book is set in 1975, or you can decide that it's set in a quasi future period or like a pocket universe if you want. It's really up to you. I already mentioned how Judith felt like a fairly modern woman. At one point, Christie mentions how there's a lot of sadism going on in the world, which sounds very much like crotchety Christie railing about Chelsea artists in the 60s and 70s. Probably
we are a terrible lot.
I think it's probably her railing against Nazism, actually, from the perspective of 1940. So I think you can support the theory that this is set in 1975, or I think you can just treat this as a quasi-future period and not be literal about it. I think that's probably the smarter way of approaching the book. But I like that we have the option and that it works either way. There was one moment that focused on the changing of times that I appreciated. It's when Poirot is complaining about the amenities, because of course he is, and he's deriding the so-called improvements of modernization. He says, the bathrooms, the taps everywhere, and what comes out of them? Lukewarm water, mon ami, at most hours of the day. And the towels, so thin, so meager. And then Hastings responds, there's something to be said for the old days, I said thoughtfully. I remembered the clouds of steam which had gushed from the hot tap of the one bathroom Styles had originally possessed, one of those bathrooms in which an immense bath with mahogany sides had reposed proudly in the middle of the bathroom floor. Remembered, too, the immense bath towels and the frequent shining brass cans of boiling hot water that stood in one's old-fashioned basin.
It sounds delightful.
It sounds wonderful. And this is very much Christie's Victorian memory of Ashfield. Anytime she's waxing poetic about a home, it's almost always Ashfield, unless it's Greenway. And we are told in The Mysterious Affair at Styles that Emily Inglethorpe liked to keep things old-fashioned. So even though we were in and around 1916 then, I think that Victorian memory is absolutely valid. The immense bath with mahogany sides was actually referenced in our last novel episode for Sleeping Murder. That's very much the bath at Ashfield. And I just have to point out that in his fond memory of the days of yore, Hastings, of course, neglects to remember all the servants that had to scurry about filling up and lugging those brass cans of boiling hot water. And I actually think that the presence of housemaids and whatnot from time to time, and the absence of any sort of complaining about the lack of or decline in quality of the help in this novel, is actually the best evidence we have that this book is not set in 1975, but is actually set in the late 1930s or around 1940, whenever Christie was writing it, because I think she never would have included a mention of a housemaid if she meant for this to be in 1975, when, of course, that was not how things were done anymore. And Christie was always very attuned to such matters of domesticity. So just really, really interesting setting and a lot to chew on there. I think we both very much appreciated setting. And then moving on to tone, there is, as we've already mentioned, so much sadness and darkness in this book. It's just not a regular Christie. There's very little lightness here, just the rare flash of, oh, wow, isn't Hastings so stupid? Yes, he is. And a few other moments that are not necessarily at Hastings' expense. I think often the Poirot-Hastings relationship is a reliable source of light comedy, but here, of course, it's laced with nostalgia and then melancholy and then finally despair when Poirot dies, and poor broken Hastings, who's already mourning his wife, is now mourning his best friend as well. That's all okay, because I think that this is a book where Christie is doing something different from what she usually does. And we have always on this podcast given Christie credit for trying something different, especially when she succeeds. And I think she does. But I'll be honest with you, it actually keeps this from being one of my very favorite Christies. I can't say that I relish or cherish this book the way that I do my very favorite Christies. And that doesn't really have to do with the quality of it, but in that we like to treat this category as the catch-all category. I just wanted to say that this really isn't actually one of my favorite Christies, but maybe that speaks to its power because it's so painful what happens in the book, because watching Poirot become Dexter and then die is upsetting because I actually care about him. So perhaps that actually speaks to what Christie is doing here so brilliantly.
I think it speaks to her ongoing skill as a writer that you care, that you even care. And, you know, for me, I couldn't see his lifelong character of this person who valued human life, that his final act was to kill someone. It was like hard for me to wrap my head around that. But it was hard because she had convinced me through all of the other novels of how much he had valued life. And so in some ways, that makes it especially successful, that it actually bothers me that it would be him acting in that manner. I have one other point. I think if I were to believe that it was in the 40s, I would have an easier time buying into the idea of Norton actually being this killer who manipulates others into doing something terrible. You probably know I'm a huge Virginia Woolf fan, and I've read everything, every diary, everything of Virginia Woolf's. And I know that at that time, there was this strong feeling and this prevalence of neighbors betraying neighbors, giving them up to the Nazis, and dying, and the darkness around that, people not believing that their neighbors could actually, rat them out, so to speak, to authorities, and that they would die as a result. And I think that it was such a time of people questioning other people's character, and the darkness in that, the darkness that you couldn't trust people that you knew well. I would like to think that there was something in the time that it was written that actually made her feel like this was a character that was sort of reflecting society at the time. Mm-hmm. It's an atmospheric thing.
That's such a great point. I think no matter when this novel was written, it was almost definitely written directly in the shadow of the Holocaust, actually. And really, Christie was incredibly productive during World War II in terms of what she wrote, but she was mainly using it as an outlet, and she wasn't reflecting the war in her book. She actually very much reflected the post-war condition in her books following the war, because she was able to use that to great effect, right? And in the ways that people actually didn't trust each other anymore and didn't know each other as well. But with the exception of NRM, which is kind of her happy take to a certain extent on a wartime spy adventure with Tommy and Tuppence, this might be the novel where she actually is imbuing her sense of the horrors of the Second World War, into the novel, that she's imbuing the character of her murderer Norton with what she sees as the downfall of humanity. That's really interesting. I think that's an excellent point. Like I said, there's a little bit of uncertainty of exactly when she was writing it, but we know it was right around in that time. So I think that's fair. And I think that's a really interesting way to read this book. And also, sets it squarely in that time. And it's why, again, the setting is just so ineffable in a dark way. It's a setting of despair. It's a setting of despair. That's what these people are: unhappy, inconsolable. And it doesn't really get better. It gets worse, because Poirot becomes a murderer and then dies. And that's why that final ending of, maybe Hastings and Elizabeth Cole, at least it could happen, that's as good as we're going to get. And Christie was such a master at marrying light and dark. And this one is just almost unrelentingly dark. And she does it well. I mean, she does it brilliantly. So it's not that she's doing it badly. It's just that it's an outlier. That's for sure.
Right. It's like I said, the only disappointment I have in the ending is of Judith going to Africa.
She gets her man
as a wife. Yeah. That to me was just, oh no, don't do that.
Well, before we rank Setting a Tone, I have one legitimate question that I'm going to just open out to all of you listeners out there, because I really didn't understand what this reference was. And I have faith that someone out there will know. About 3/4 of the way through the book, Poirot is talking about Dr. Franklin being more than adequate of a doctor for purposes of Poirot consulting him about his health. And this is what Poirot says to Hastings. He has the qualifications. In fact, I should say that, as the films say, he knows his stuff better than most. And that phrase, he knows his stuff better than most, is in quotations. I Googled this. I really tried. Google failed me. Google almost never fails me. So if anyone knows what that's a reference to, I'm guessing it's a movie maybe that was popular perhaps in the late 30s or around 1940 when Christie was writing this. I'd really love to hear it. So let me know. You could always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. But I think we're both coming out pretty high then on Setting and Tone. Where were you landing, Linda?
I put an 8.
I had said a 7, but I'm actually, now that we've just been raving about everything that Christie does here, I am happy to do an 8. All right, so 8 then on Setting and Tone. Our final category involves depictions stuck in their time. Unfortunately, sometimes, and I feel like recently this has been a pretty quick conversation. It's not going to be the longest conversation we've ever had, but there's some stuff here. There's definitely some stuff going on that we have to discuss. So we already mentioned all of the Mrs. Luttrell hate. It's just extremely, extremely and shockingly misogynistic. But of course, Christie does not necessarily endorse what her characters say, even when they are Poirot or Hastings. For another example, Mrs. Luttrell herself, a victim of all this misogyny, this is what she says of women doing science: leave that sort of thing to the frumps. And, we can just laugh at her and we don't have to ascribe her opinion to Christie. Frumps or frumpy was always a favorite word of Catherine's, by the way. I feel like she often described herself as frumpy, so that made me think of her. But I think that a failure to endorse a statement only gets us so far, especially when we run into an issue as deep-rooted in Christie as ableism. Yes. We've talked about ableism before. That involves the sense in so many of Christie's stories that people whose bodies don't work the same way as the majority of the population, these people are broken and their lives aren't worth as much as the quote unquote normal people. And we definitely get this sense here from Poirot. For instance, here is what he says upon first reuniting with Hastings. And this is a series of lines that is preserved in the Suchet adaptation, I might add. Me, said Poirot with a grimace. I am a wreck. I am a ruin. I cannot walk. I am crippled and twisted. Mercifully, I can still feed myself, but otherwise I have to be attended to like a baby, put to bed, washed and dressed. Enfin, it is not amusing, that. Mercifully, though the outside decays, the core is still sound. And there's more than a tinge of ableism there, with a bit of ageism, I think, thrown in for good measure. I just have to imagine that for people reading this book who might live their lives in a wheelchair or have limited mobility or other bodily challenges, that this aspect of the novel very much mars the read. I think it has to make it a tough read.
Just two other examples from the text, but there really are so many more. We have the idea that Norton has, quote, always been slightly lame and was unable to take part in games at school, end quote, partly accounting for his murderous nature. That is both absurd and offensive. And then in his manuscript at the end of the novel, Poirot is telling Hastings how he pulled off the murder of Norton. And we realize that this entire time he has been pretending not to be able to walk. He's been shamming in the wheeled chair. And to me, this read a little hijinksy in a problematic way. We actually came across a similar issue in The Pale Horse, in which there was another character in a wheeled chair, and the possibility of him shamming and actually being able to walk was brought up in a jarringly jocular way as a narrative possibility, and one of the ways that that character could have actually committed the crime. She didn't go there in that novel with that character, but she does go there with Poirot, and I think it's hard to read.
I agree with that. And I think I earlier referred to the euthanasia discussion in it as well, and the justification that it was no concern if someone died who they referred to as a cretin, but that if you were able to somehow be a, in quote, normal person, that person's life had more value.
If you'd like, I can quote those at length, Linda. I want to give the weird eugenic stuff its due, because I think Dr. Franklin is yet another of these professional men who appear so often in a Christie novel spouting weirdo philosophies that many of us here in the 21st century find extremely distasteful. Although, again, let's have humility. I wonder what horrors we're spouting, perhaps in this very episode, that people in the 22nd century would be horrified by. But yeah, I mean, Dr. Franklin seems to sympathize with the eugenics movement or some sort of eugenics adjacent philosophy. And here are some choice quotes on that front. It's an idea of mine, you know, that about 80% of the human race ought to be eliminated. We'd get on much better without them. Very glad he is not my doctor. Here he is again. If a healthy man dies, it doesn't matter much. If an imbecile, a cretin, dies, it's a good thing. But if by the discovery of administering the correct gland, you turn your cretin into a healthy, normal individual by correcting his thyroid deficiency, that, to my mind, matters a good deal. Oh, Lordy, I think we can officially make a new rule that whenever a professional man, either medical or legal, starts talking about glands in a Christie novel, it is time to head for the hills. I'm out. When glands come up, I'm out. And, you know, just as the awful theories that were spouted in Nemesis as to attacks of a sexual nature weren't necessarily endorsed by Christie, I think you can make the same argument that I believe my co-host Jamie Berntal did on that episode when we were ranking the novel, that the views are so abhorrent that without greater refutation on the part of someone in the novel, they just significantly hinder one's enjoyment of the book. And then Acolyte Judith, of course, also has some shocking things to say along the same lines. Here's a quote from her. I don't hold life as sacred as all you people do. Unfit lives, useless lives, they should be got out of the way. There's so much mess about. Only people who can make a decent contribution to the community ought to be allowed to live. The others ought to be put painlessly away. I mean, Judith is only 21, so you're allowed to be an idiot when you're 21. But yeah, it's extremely distasteful. And it's peppered throughout the book as well. It's really there quite often. And then finally, I just have a few bits and pieces of nasty stuff that I feel like I have to mention in this category. First off, there's a story about a girl who Boyd Carrington seduced. She's described as sure of herself, modern, independent. She is then said to have killed herself by taking Veronal, which made me think of Carlotta Adams and Lord Edward Dies. And then she is later pronounced by Poirot himself as having been, quote, a neurotic type who came of poor stock. So that explains away why she killed herself. I mean, that is worth one deduction all on its own. That's just terrible. Okay. Our murderer, Norton, is, quote, the only son of a masterful and bossy woman. That's the only time that Norton's mother gets referenced. So I guess it's his mother's fault that he's a murderer. Then there are multiple references to Dr. Franklin being a quote unquote slave driver by how hard he works and forces Judith to work. And also the notion that Judith herself is a quote unquote slave driver. And finally, when Hastings looks at some photographs of West African natives, he pronounces them, quote, really quite entertaining, with an exclamation point. Oh, Hastings.
Yes.
A chauvinist and a racist as well. But we still love you. You are of your time, and your depiction is very much of its time. It just feels like there's enough here that for me, I came down on 3 deductions. I don't know where you landed on this category, Linda.
Well, I have the same examples noted as you do, with 2 more. Boyd Carrington, referring to Nurse Craven, saying, good-looking girl, lovely hair and teeth. Fine specimen of womanhood. It's just like, are we talking about a woman or a horse? And then also Hastings on Mrs. Franklin, women in certain condition of nervous collapse did get these persistent ideas. It's just, yes. Also, right at the beginning, we have Hastings being called my faithful dog, excellent and loyal Hastings. And he's stupid and clumsy. And I know it's his way of being endearing, I guess, but I don't know. And then we have Curtis, who is described by Hastings as having been a helper in a mental hospital. And weren't patients sometimes allowed to be helpers? A queer, dumb, stupid-looking man, a man who might kill for some strange, warped idea of his own.
I will argue on Christie's behalf that I think a lot of those questionable opinions and statements are in the mouths of characters, and especially, Boyd Carrington. Well, whatever the blowhard Boyd Carrington is saying, that is true to who he is. And unfortunately, Hastings and Poirot too. And I think a lot of those statements are not being endorsed by Christie, which is a game that we play as readers anyway. Right. And we can never know what's being endorsed. I mean, I'll say this, the only time we've gone above 4 deductions was for The Secret of Chimneys, which did get 6 deductions, and Hickory Dickory Dock, which got 8. We did do 4 deductions for The Big Four. We gave Nemesis 4 deductions.
I was giving it 4 deductions, yes.
I can be bumped up 1. So I'm happy with 4 deductions for depictions stuck in their time. All right. Well, believe it or not, Linda, it is finally that time in the episode, many, many hours later, where we tally up the scores and figure out where Curtin, Poirot's last case, falls in the rankings. This is the last time that I'm going to get to do this. So for Curtin, we have 8 plus 6 plus 9 plus 5 plus 8 minus 4 deductions for a grand total of 32 points. And this puts Curtin in a big old tie. We have a ton of titles that are at 32 points. They're hanging out around 18 to 28 within the rankings. So Curtin is officially in the top half of the Christie canon, and that makes sense to me. I definitely wanted it to be in the top half. I think it deserves to be pretty high, but not in the top 10. I mentioned this to you before we started recording, Linda, but I was determined to keep Peril at End House at number 10 because I know that was so important to Catherine. So I did not want to knock it out by putting Curtin in the top 10, nor do I think that Curtin deserves to be in the top 10. So let me just read out the novels in descending order that have 32 points, and we can figure out where to slot this in. Evil Under the Sun, 3-Act Tragedy, Appointment with Death, Lord Edgware Dies, The Pale Horse, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, The Body in the Library, Taken at the Flood, Cat Among the Pigeons, The Sittaford Mystery, and 450 from Paddington. I'll be honest with you, I would just put it above all of them. Right?
I would agree with that too. Yes.
With the potential exception of Evil Under the Sun, but I think that that's very much up for grabs, and let's just err on the side of celebrating Curtin in this final episode. Right. Okay, great. I'm glad that we feel similarly. That means that Curtin is sitting at number 18 out of officially 66 novels. We have now ranked every single Agatha Christie novel. I will have at least one episode. I'm actually going to have multiple episodes about these rankings. So much maneuvering and machinations with these rankings, listeners. Have no fear. But I just want to read out then the official and final top 10, because I don't think that this is going to change. Here is our top 10 Christie novels: Five Little Pigs, And Then There Were None, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Endless Night, Crooked House, A Murder is Announced, Murder on the Orient Express, The Hollow, Death on the Nile, and in 10th place, Peril at End House. You're welcome, Catherine Brobeck. And I feel really good about that top 10. I feel really good about where we're placing Curtin. How do you feel?
I really appreciate the first top 10. I agree with all of those.
As you can tell, I mean, I really want to continue doing this podcast. And I know Catherine wanted to continue doing the podcast beyond ranking the 66 novels. So I still have a small handful of short stories, which I held back on purpose so that we have one more Poirot, one more Miss Marple, one more Parker Pine, one more Mysterious Mr. Quinn, Satterthwaite Quinn story to go. So then there's just always more, and there's always something new popping up in the world of Agatha Christie and in mystery. So I'm not going anywhere. And I do, though, just want to thank you again, Linda, for this momentous episode, because I think this was so hard, but certainly no one else could have done it the way that you did. And I think it's the perfect celebration of Catherine. You are not Catherine, obviously, but I think being here and being able to have this conversation with you and to talk about her and mourn her and celebrate her. And that's something that you're obviously going to keep on doing after we finish recording this, but to be able to do that and share a little bit of that with as many people as will be listening to this. I know it's meaningful to me, and I'm sure that it's very meaningful to so many of the people who are listening as well.
I just would like to thank you for sure, but also thank all the listeners. Catherine loved you. She was so excited when an episode would come on and air, and she'd get comments on Twitter or on another social media.
Unless they were about her voice.
Well, we laughed and talked about that a great deal. That was actually kind
and her
of
voice was awesome. Just to be clear.
And I'll tell you, and I'm suffering from a little bit of laryngitis today, so I sound croaky too. But I think it might have been one of the last episodes she did. I was driving home, and I was listening in the car, and I had finished listening to the episode, and I called her, and I just said, I am so proud of you for creating such a wonderful, wonderful podcast. I'm just so proud of you. And she was like, oh, Mom, and I'm so thankful that that's the last conversation that I had about Agatha with her, was to tell her how proud I was of her. And by extension of you, Kemper. I think the two of you created magic together, and that her voice is still there for me to listen to. It means everything to me.
I'm so glad.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's not going anywhere. It'll be around forever, for as long as machines are around anyway, which will be long after both of us are here. So that really means a lot to me. Thank you, Linda. Well, the curtain has fallen on Curtin, Poirot's Last Case. This podcast's review of the 66 novels written by Agatha Christie has come to an end, but this podcast has not come to an end. As I just mentioned to Linda, there are many more episodes to come having to do with further Agatha Christie content that I have not covered, Agatha Christie adjacent content, mystery content. There are a lot of different ways to go from here, and I have no intention of disappearing from your podcast feeds. I knew that this would be such a difficult episode, but I knew early on that if Linda would agree to do it, she was the only person who could co-host this episode with me. And I have to say, in addition to the very obvious personal investment she brought to the episode. Linda was a fantastic co-host. The apple obviously does not fall very far from the tree. So many insights into this book that I never even thought of. I cannot overstate how impressed I am by what she did on this, dare I say, mother of all episodes. That pun was for you, Catherine. I'm going to sign off now, as I usually do, and encourage you to look for bonus content over on the podcast Patreon site. That is at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha, or just click the link in the notes to this episode. You can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And if you have gotten to the end of this episode and you have not given the podcast a rating or a review, what is happening? Please just take an extra minute. You've already devoted so many minutes to Curtin and to me and to Linda and to Catherine. Take one more and give the podcast a rating and or a review on whatever platform you are using to listen to it. I usually end these episodes by saying, see you next time, and I will see you next time, but that feels a little too casual for what is, if not a final episode of the podcast, a watershed episode of the podcast. So instead, I'll say this to you, my dear friends, mes chers amis, in that oh so terrible French accent, or is it Belgian accent, that Catherine delighted in making fun of. Not adieu, but au revoir. À bientôt.
Ready to level up your career? Text DISH to 44043 now to dive into a world of exciting technician opportunities at DISH. From cutting-edge technology to a supportive work environment, DISH offers the perfect platform for your success. Connect with us today to discover how you can be part of a dynamic team driving innovation. Connect today and join the DISH family, where innovation meets opportunity. Text DISH to 44043 to kickstart your journey towards a rewarding career.
At the UPS Store, we know things can get busy this upcoming holiday. You can count on us to be open and ready to help with any packing and shipping or anything else you might need.
Is there anything you can't do?
Actually, I don't have a good singing voice. The UPS... Nope. But our certified packing experts can pack and ship just about anything.
At least that's good.
The UPS Store. Be unstoppable. Most locations are independently owned. Product, services, pricing, and hours of operation may vary. See Center for details. Come in today to get your holiday goodies there on time.